At some point. We want to go to Louisville, Kentucky now. One of the most prominent members of the House of Representatives in the House Foreign Affairs Committee is Representative Lee Hamilton, Democrat of Indiana, who had been a voice of moderation and prudence in the days leading up to what is now Operation Desert Storm. Congressman Hamilton, what is your reaction based on what you're hearing tonight?
Well, my reaction is hopeful. It sounds as if the early stages of the military action is going in a favorable direction, and I hope the people who put forward the optimistic scenario, military scenario, in the last few days will be proven right.
You have been one of those who believe that we needed to give sanctions a much longer time to operate. If the military operation goes as it now seems to be going, do you think that President Bush ultimately did make the right decision?
Well, I think the debate we had in the Congress is behind us now. I took the position that there was a better alternative to war. I was comfortable with that position, but the Congress rejected that, moved on to support the president. Let's put that debate behind us. The president has now made his decision, and it seems to me my responsibility, the responsibility of most of us, perhaps all of us in the Congress, is to support the country, to support the president, and certainly to support the men and women in the field.
Congressman Hamilton, what kind of policy debate should now take effect about the American role in the Middle East?
Well, I think there are a number of policy debates. The most immediate one, I think, is to make sure that our military objectives are in sync, are coordinated with our political objectives. Once we move beyond the immediate crisis, the post-crisis period, then I think we have a lot of questions before us. Among them, what kind of a security regime will you establish in the Middle East to make sure that Saddam Hussein or whoever follows him of his ilk will not have the power to threaten neighbors? All kinds of economic questions will be present. There will be forces operating there that we will have to deal with, democratization, Islamic fundamentalism, and I guess the point is that war isn't going to solve all our problems. Even with war and a successful result of a war, we're still going to be confronted with very formidable challenges in the Middle East.
Congressman Lee Hamilton, Democrat of Indiana, speaking to us tonight from Louisville, Kentucky. Thank you very much, Congressman. It's always a pleasure. General Bill Odom is with us now, retired general, military strategist, student of American military movements and also political developments in this country. How will we know how well we're doing and how well we have done in the first 24 hours of the strike?
I think it will take the whole of tomorrow and maybe even longer to assess with great accuracy precisely the results of the attacks. The initial reports sound quite good, but I wouldn't be confident about knowing the realities out there and for a good 24 hours. It'll take both our technical intelligence and other kinds of intelligence a number of hours to actually confirm some of these matters. Some targets that have been confirmed as knocked out will be restored. So that'll be a changing picture, I think, over the next day.
Do you think that they have the capacity to do a quick repair, and you can put your ear back in there in a moment?
In some areas, yes. In others, I think shortage of spare parts, lack of skilled personnel, a number of factors will impede their ability to restore their capabilities.
We were listening to Les Aspin just a few moments ago, and he was saying we have to be very careful because the reports are almost always encouraging in the initial phases of any military operation. That's prudent advice, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've been a little worried about the excessive optimism tonight. I'd like to have 3 or 4 days hindsight before I make a very firm judgment on what the impact of these initial airstrikes are. Many of them, I think, will have to be repeated.
And the Iraqi Air Force, how much of it can be in bunkers and really outside the range of the American bombers?
I don't think it can be outside the range. If there are bunkered facilities which we don't have the weapons to penetrate, some aircraft could survive. But I'm sure the Pentagon knows that. And if we're getting reports that their entire Air Force has been destroyed, I would be inclined to believe those, particularly if those reports remain unaltered over the next 24 hours.
So what does he have left if all of this is true? If we've knocked out command and control, if we've gone after the Scud missiles, if we've done great damage to radar, nuclear and chemical capacity, what's his next move? Think like Saddam Hussein? I know that that's a reach for someone like you, but try to think as he might.
He has a large number of soldiers in very well-prepared positions along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. He has a large number of divisions down on the Iraq-Kuwaiti border and also in the central part of Kuwait. It's one thing to knock out radar sites and missiles. It's another thing to destroy the tanks. And there are several thousands of those tanks, and we have yet to hear from them. If I were Saddam Hussein, I would be doing everything I could to know how much of that capability is still extant and to try to put it into the best fighting shape I could.
All right, Bill Summers, we're going to ask you to, pardon me, Bill Odom, we're going to ask you to stand by here so we can go to Harry Summers in Washington, D.C., retired colonel, and the fairness doctrine is in play here tonight as well. We have retired Rear Admiral Ken Morinville, who is an expert on naval aviation. Admiral, tell us first of all about those Tomahawk cruise missiles. They cost about $1,200,000 apiece. They apparently led the first wave. Did that surprise you at all?
No, it didn't surprise me. Normal tactics would be to use the cruise missile in coordination with an airstrike to take out the critical things that you want to take out in coordination with an airstrike. It's also a very accurate weapon. If you have a fixed target that's not going to move around, the Tomahawk missile is very accurate and can hit it.
And they fly low and slow. Why couldn't the Iraqis intercept them?
Well, for starters, I don't think they're going to intercept anything at night with their aircraft. The cruise missile could be intercepted in the daytime if you detect it on radar and if you have a fighter in place to get it. But it's a very small target, relatively hard to hit. And it's a perfect weapon, though, for night.
And what about the planes that were used in this attack? How did they avoid detection in a place like Iraq, which is known that this attack has been coming for a long, long time? It was not secret to anyone, even a street corner vendor in Baghdad.
Well, there are several ways that you avoid getting shot down. I don't know the plans for the strike, obviously, but you would have jamming aircraft perhaps accompanying the strike if you're going in at high level. On a typical strike, you may have jamming aircraft, jamming radar sites. All Navy aircraft that would be involved have self-protection electronic countermeasure gear, which you energize, and it makes, if they do shoot a missile at you, or if they're tracking you with the radar-laid guns, it'll make them miss.
And Colonel Summers, as you've been listening to all of this tonight, what concerns you? What kind of rattles around at the back of your mind saying there's something that may be slightly out of kilter here?
As I said earlier, I'm very surprised to see that we caught the Iraqi Air Force unaware and for our planes to come back without losses. I can only believe that we achieved strategic surprise because Saddam Hussein just didn't believe we were going to do it, that he thought President Bush was bluffing, and as Secretary Baker said some time ago, he just added another major miscalculation on top of the ones that he's made earlier.
All right, Colonel Harry Summers, General Bill Odom, and Admiral Morinville, if we'll ask you to stand by because there will be more reports coming along. We want to tell you as well that Fred Francis is now confirming there have been exchanges of artillery fire along the Iraqi-Saudi border. No reports yet of troop movements across the border in either direction. Fred, are they anticipating that there may be some ground forces engaged before too long?
Tom, we know that some of the U.S. Army units have flown their Apache tank-killing helicopters across the border and have engaged in some kind of combat. And we are told that the very formidable Iraqi artillery fired south into Khafji, which is a village in the northeastern part of Saudi Arabia, and the forwardmost position where Saudi troops are dug in. And there was an exchange of artillery fire there, and some of the Saudi troops pulled back, and not in retreat, but just in a tactical move, but there has been no movement across the border. Artillery exchanges back and forth could have been expected, but there have been no mobile, no tanks going north, no tanks coming south. That was not expected on the Iraqi side, that they would attack south. They're certainly not in that position to do so, and it was certainly not expected that the U.S. would attack north. So as we talked earlier about the best case scenario, the worst case scenario is like General Odom said, Bill Odom said, that the air war will not knock out all the Republican Guards Division and all those dug-in troops, and that U.S. tanks in 10 or 12 days will have to move north and will have to go through that artillery fire, which I said is very formidable.
Fred, did they ever work out that business about the Syrian ground troops and whether or not they would become actively involved?
Yes, they did, Tom, and they worked it out a long time ago, and the Syrians just didn't want to make it public. The Syrians said they would go into Kuwait, but they would not go into to Iraq. So it's fully expected that again, we're talking rosy scenarios here, but if there are surrenders and if there are large areas of Kuwait that the Allied forces have to move into, that the Egyptians and the Syrians will do that, and that U.S. forces will not do that. And the Syrians have agreed to go into Kuwait. They have agreed to be combat players in this if that becomes necessary. They have not agreed to go into Iraq, and I doubt that troops going into Iraq would be necessary. That would be a very worst case scenario.
And Fred, the fact is the United States is not very eager to go into Iraq either, right?
Oh, not at all. I mean, again, something that Bill Odom said, you don't start a war without knowing what kind of peace you want to have, and I don't think this has been fully thought out. Bill Odom mentioned we may have to put some sort of administration into Iraq. Well, that would be a terrible thing. You know, that would mean a long-term presence for a long-term presence for U.S. soldiers. You don't want to go into Iraq and sort of set up a government. Although I will tell you that the United States Army and the Pentagon has planned to go into Kuwait to reestablish a civil government there, and there are approximately 2,000 U.S. servicemen, Guard and Reserves, who are in Saudi Arabia now, who are planning that to go into Kuwait to restore civil government before the Kuwaitis go back in.
All right, Fred Francis at the Pentagon. We are still awaiting a second update tonight. We had the first one from Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, General Colin Powell, at 9:30 tonight. That was about 2.5 hours ago. No additional word. We will tell you that now in the Persian Gulf area in Iraq, it's about 8 o'clock in the morning, or coming up on that, about an 8-hour time difference there altogether. The attacks began at night. It's now daytime. That's a trickier proposition, of course, for an airstrike, but it will also give a chance for the satellites to get a clear look at the damage that has been done, and they'll be assessing those photographs, high resolution, at the CIA and at the Defense Intelligence Agencies throughout the day, because they should be coming in before too long. We will not have access to them, but that will be the basis for some of the report. We want to tell you that NBC News will have continuing uninterrupted coverage of Operation Desert Storm, America at War, throughout the evening and throughout the morning here on this NBC station. We'll be back after this. We continue now with our coverage of what is going on in the Persian Gulf. It's not been a quiet time in the rest of the world as well. NBC's Tom Pettit now is in Moscow tonight. He is there with the reform-minded editor of Ogoniok, which is one of the most popular magazines in that country, one of the leading advocates of Glasnost, Vitaly Karatic. Tom Pettit, tell us what's going on there and what's on Vitaly's mind tonight.
Well, the situation in Moscow is a bit unusual. The government has not said anything one way or the other about the U.S. military intervention with the UN forces in the Gulf, though the Soviet Union had supported that action.
Yes, from the early morning I listen over the gymnastics music in my radio, but I have 3 phone calls from my friends about the start of the war. People are troubled.
Didn't Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, in effect, by their support, make this possible?
They made this possible because we are allies of civilized humanity, and we try to fight against aggression. It's kind of our repentance for all our Afghanistans and many events before. I think now we did what we must do, but we have a lot of internal events at the same time, and it's a dangerous moment.
Do you see a danger in the Soviet Union because the world's attention is centered on the Gulf?
First, then we had meetings of anti-Semitic Parliament organization who called to support Saddam Hussein. We have rumors and the calls from Muslim organization who want to support, and we have generals with philosophy of Saddam Hussein who started events in Baltics.
Are you more worried about the Soviet military or about the Soviet Muslims?
I think that I am afraid a little because our hardliners in many ways try to destroy the situation using this pretext that all the concentration will be on Persian Gulf. Everybody will listen only there, and they can do here all they like. I think the philosophy of United Nations must be higher than philosophy of Saddam Hussein.
But you do find, and I think this is what you said earlier, that there's a genuine fear that Gorby will lose it, that he'll lose power to the generals now.
I think he's their hostage. I never believe that he'll support their actions as he wants to do this. But only thing I believe that hostage or supporter, he must understand that we are part of humanity and part of war process. And events in Persian Gulf are very important, but they must not close what's going in our country, because general fight for freedom is everywhere, and we are fighting here in Persian Gulf, and we must win everywhere.
But here you're fighting against the people who want independence. You're killing 14 people in Vilnius, 1 in Riga. What kind of freedom fight is that?
I think that we must support them. We must support people who are fighting for their freedom, and we must fight against the philosophy of colonels who want to stop them killing them. I think what was done there in Vilnius was out of law, and it must be stopped, because it's the same level of danger as the aggression everywhere. It was aggression against people. But now we are waiting for the results of legal prosecution. We want to have Attorney General in this, and I think it must be closed, but in legal way.
You think this war in the Gulf will be popular in the Soviet Union with the people?
Wars are always unpopular in America, in the Soviet Union, but we must fight for justice, and justice must be everywhere. And if we'll stop aggression in Kuwait, it means that we'll have more freedom around us. And I think it will be a dangerous moment, but necessary moment.
But there's a dangerous moment here in the Soviet Union, too, isn't there? Because while that's going on, Gorbachev can do whatever he wants to here.
Yes, but in the same time, I think that...
Okay. You don't know, I don't know, right? Maybe Tom Brokaw does. Tom?
Vitaly Karatic, thank you very much for being with us tonight. He is one of the bravest and really one of the most enterprising journalists in the history of the Soviet Union. He has an enormously popular magazine there called Ogonyak. He's done a lot of major investigative reporting, and he has been a voice for reform and freedom for a long time. We'll be back right after this.
From NBC News, America at War continues. Here's Tom Brokaw.
Operation Desert Storm, that's the name of the mostly air campaign that is underway tonight in the Persian Gulf. Units of the American Air Force and naval aviators, as well as British fighter planes and Saudi fighter planes as well, attacks on military targets throughout Iraq and Kuwait. The initial reports are that it is all going very well. In fact, it is going astonishingly well. There have been no reports of any casualties or even planes lost at this time, although that is unlikely the case. The Israelis are extremely impressed with the way it is going. They fear that they would be attacked as soon as Iraq was hit from the west, but so far Iraq has not been able to launch any kind of an attack against the Israelis. We are told that Saddam Hussein has been on radio tonight. We do not know whether that is true or not, but there is a report out of Nicosia, Cyprus, that a radio report had Saddam Hussein saying to the Iraqi people, President Bush is a hypocritical criminal. He vowed to crush the satanic intentions of the White House. Whether that was live or pre-recorded, we cannot say. How he's going to do that remains a mystery tonight. He is a resourceful man. He is ruthless indeed, and he does have capacity. From a military point of view, how much of that is left, we cannot say at this hour. NBC's John Cochran at the White House. What can we expect from there for the rest of the evening, John?
Not much. They have what they call a lid here. Everybody's pretty much gone home except the people down in the Situation Room in the basement, and those people are not permitted, of course, to talk to the press, Tom. The president himself headed over toward the residential headquarters a couple of hours ago. You know, he's a fairly early-to-bed guy, and I suspect that's even true tonight. He has a house guest tonight, the Reverend Billy Graham, an old family friend, an old spiritual advisor, and, of course, an old friend of many other presidents who've gone through crises, both personal and political, and, of course, that included Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. Tomorrow, the president's schedule is bare bones. It's very understated. They say at 8 o'clock in the morning he'll get an intelligence briefing. I'll bet he gets an intelligence briefing a lot earlier than 8 o'clock in the morning, because he's going to want to know as soon as he pops out of bed what the reconnaissance photos show, what the bomb damage assessment photos show. And so I would think that we might even be hearing from the president himself by 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. He might walk in here or certainly have his press secretary give us the president's reaction to the news, which, of course, so far looks good, but until it's sunlight there, we won't know for sure, Tom.
Cochran, thank you very much. Well, we're getting more now on this so-called radio broadcast of Saddam Hussein. He has not lost his capacity for passionate language. He is saying that the glorious sons of our nation, we will continue our campaign, the battle for justice against vice, of the believers against the infidels. The great showdown has begun. That is a report that is being monitored tonight out of Cyprus from Baghdad Radio. Whether or not that is an accurate accounting of what he is saying, we cannot say for sure, or whether in fact it is Saddam Hussein himself or a pre-recording. Neither can we say that, but it is the kind of language he has been using from the very beginning, saying that American forces will swim in blood. He called Kuwait, of course, his 19th province as well. Someone who is watching this with very keen interest tonight is in Chicago right now. Her name is Deborah Hattie. She's from Louisville, Kentucky originally. She's married to a Kuwaiti, and her husband still is in Kuwait. Ms. Hattie was able to escape from Kuwait in a garbage truck after the invasion. I know this seems like an obvious question, but what are your thoughts at this hour?
I'm just praying for everyone over it.
You have a cousin as well on Operation Desert Storm. You're caught in the vice here, in a matter of speaking.
Yes, I do. We just hope to God it's over quickly and Kuwait can be restored, the government can be restored, and we can get back to our families, if indeed we have families left.
Have you been able to have any contact with your husband in Kuwait at all, Debbie?
I did in December. Since December, nothing.
And how is he keeping himself safe and secure?
I don't know that at this point.
Was he there in an undercover capacity of some kind? Can you describe that? I know you want to be careful because we don't want to put him in any kind of a peril.
All I can say is there's a very heavy resistance inside Kuwait. They're heavily armed. They were waiting on the first strike from outside, and they want to be fighting inside, and that's for all the Kuwaitis inside. Their words to me were, let us take the Iraqi bullets. Let the Americans come in and save our souls for our children.
And Debbie, how do you briefly describe for us how you were able to get out of Kuwait after the invasion?
Well, Tom, I had to escape in a garbage truck. 400 troops took over a school across the street from my home, and they were committing atrocities daily. They come on national radio and said they would kill any Kuwaitis, the whole family, not just 1 or 2 members who were caught harboring Americans and Westerners. So my mother-in-law and sister-in-law pulled up a garbage truck, which my husband had got for them, and I got in the back of it, and they put garbage over me and took me to meet up with the American Embassy staff out in the desert, and they then took me to Baghdad, where we were stripped of all of our money and gold, and they were taking our children. They were taking babies from the American women and saying that they were now Iraqi because they were born in Kuwait. And it was really a big mess. I feared for my life the whole time that I was there, and I have feared for my husband's life and his whole family through this whole crisis. I'm just glad to see that it might be over soon.
Debbie Hattie, thank you very much for tonight, sharing this brave and poignant story with us, and we hope that it will be well for you and for your husband, and you can all be reunited before too long.
Thank you.
In Saudi Arabia right now, NBC's Arthur Kent, who has been up these many long hours. Arthur, what's the latest from Saudi Arabia?
Well, Tom, we were trying to confirm that report from Washington. Fred Francis had told us that the Saudi border town of Khafji, just south of Kuwait and very close to Iraqi frontline positions, had been hit by artillery fire. Now, we went to the Saudi government spokesman here, and as we might have expected, no comment was their word. Now, we're in sort of an information blackout here, in particular from the Saudi authorities. And indeed, if you are a Saudi Arabian citizen today, you're somewhat in the dark, even though the sun is up now, because Saudi television is carrying no news of the attack, the U.S.-led attack into Kuwait and Iraq, and radio as well is silent. So very long lag time here for these citizens who are very deeply involved in the conflict, very much further behind than you and I in knowing exactly what's going on.
Okay, NBC's Arthur Kent, we want to we want to have a continuing update now on the military situation, prospects and concerns of our military experts who are with us. General Bill Odom is in our studio in New York. Listen, it was, what, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, that General Waller was saying we won't be ready until mid-February, possibly, to launch some kind of a ground attack if this airstrike fails. Will the ground forces be ready?
Well, I think the coordination of the attack, the sequence, is important. By starting it earlier, it's a much tighter schedule to get the ground forces that are coming in from Europe ready for the campaign. Obviously, they can go ahead with the ground campaign without some of these forces from Europe having completely closed. But I think there is a little disadvantage for the ground forces to start earlier rather than later.
But if the airstrike is just 80% effective, that will soften up the ground opposition a lot.
No question about it, but the coordination, and I mean by that, taking advantage of the devastating impact that the air strikes have soon enough is important. If a certain amount of time lapses, the Iraqis will get over it, and they will repair their positions, restore their weapons, and they will be more difficult to deal with.
We want to go to Washington now. Retired Rear Admiral Kenneth Moranville, who is an expert on naval aviation, is there with Colonel Harry Summers. Admiral Moranville, what happens day 2 of an airstrike of this kind? Planes lifting off from the carriers out in the Persian Gulf?
I would expect that. I've heard lots of people discuss that we could do a good job at night out there in a war with the Iraqis. I think we can do equally as good a job in the daytime. The problem's a little bit different. They're able to sight you with visual sighting devices in the daytime, but our tactics will permit us to go and hit the targets in the daytime as well, and I would expect to see lots more airplanes if we do it in the daytime, because you don't have the problem not being able to see each other in the daytime.
And what kind of aircraft will we be using in your judgment? Will they continue to go to the heavy fighter bombers like the Stealth and the F-111 and keep the F-15s and the F-16s, for that matter, for a different kind of close air support?
I would expect to see all types in the daytime battle. The commanders will plan, if they have specific missions that they want to fly at night and they need to reserve some airplanes for those missions, they'll do that. But I would not anticipate they would withhold airplanes if they're available to fly. I would think that we would do an all-out effort and launch all we had.
And Colonel Harry Summers, weigh in with me for a moment here on what General Odom and I were talking about a few moments ago about the preparation of those forces that just got down there from Europe, which is a whole different kind of theater from a military point of view.
Exactly, although I must say, 7th Army has been for years our best Army forces. We've kept them at a high state of readiness because of the Soviet threat. They're very well trained. They have a training center in Europe, not like the Desert Training Center, but one very capable. So these are very good troops. They're highly trained. Readiness is always, you never have 100%, and the commander in the field must be convinced that he's able to move. Otherwise, I don't think the president would have made the strike.
All right, we're going to do the television equivalent here of kind of four-corner tag. We have NBC's Fred Francis at the Pentagon. We want to keep Admiral Moranville and Colonel Summers there in Washington and General Bill Odom on the air in New York. Fred, what are the questions on your mind for these experts tonight?
Well, just a bit of news first, Tom. A senior Pentagon official has just told me that the Pentagon and indeed the command center in Saudi Arabia cannot confirm any launches of Scud missiles, Iraqi Scud missiles, and those, of course, are the ground-to-ground missiles, which have a range of approximately 375 miles. So what we're basically talking about is about 4 hours into this, and the Iraqis have apparently not gotten off any of their missiles anywhere towards Israel or anywhere towards Saudi Arabia. So that is the news, and we can only surmise from that that a great many of those missiles were knocked out. And I would ask Ken Moranville, you know, how you go after the rest of those targets, because it's just not the Scud missiles that he has. He has these other launchers with what they call frog missiles, and they're much shorter range. When aircraft go in, do they blind them with countermeasures, and how could you get the folks at home to understand countermeasures? You know, what actually happens in that kind of environment when the attacks roll in during the day? Admiral Moranville.
Well, there are two types of attack that you might make. If you want to go in low and surprise him and go in under the radar horizon and go low enough so that they're not going to detect you in time to shoot you down, and most of the surface air missiles do not have a great low altitude capability, and I'm talking about very low nap of the earth flying. That's one way. And you would not rely on a lot of countermeasures to protect you. If you have another target that you want to send that you need to get a lot of bombs on in a hurry to kill the target, then you might go in at a higher altitude. And the problem there, if you're at the higher altitude, of course, you're in the heart of the missile envelope. That's when you would rely on jamming aircraft on your own self-protective ECM gear. And the way that works, those jammers go with the strike. They jam the enemy acquisition and tracking radars. If they do, or if they are able to see through the jamming and launch a missile at an aircraft, the aircraft, those that have defensive ECM gear, energize that, and that gear causes the missile to miss the aircraft.
So is this is the electronic warfare we've heard so much about over the years?
Yes.
Is that what we're seeing here? And can you correlate this with, or can you analyze this with what happened in the raid on Libya? I mean, was this much the same thing, much the same missile environment?
The raid on Libya was done all at very low altitude. It was the kind of a raid that you do if you're going to start and you try seeking surprise. They went in very low. Now the Libyans did shoot missiles, and they even shot missiles straight up in the air with what we call ballistic shots. And they knew the missile was not locked on an aircraft when it was launched, but they launched them anyway. One of the problems you have when you do that is with the AAA, what we call AAA. Those are guns.
Anti-aircraft guns.
Anti-aircraft guns, and they have all sizes of them. Some will reach up to considerable altitude, 15,000, 18,000 feet. They also have the 23 millimeter gun, which is extremely dangerous if you're down low. So that's the problem you have if you're trying to do a sneak raid. And if you find that he has a lot of those small caliber guns, the 23 millimeters, they're very accurate, and they can shoot a hose of lead at you. So
we've been doing a lot of flag waving here. The cold hard assessment is that in a daylight attack, we're quite likely to lose some aircraft coming off those carriers and coming off the bases in Saudi Arabia. Is that not correct, Admiral Moranville?
I would expect that we would have some aircraft hit by AAA. If you're going to deliver a bomb on a target, you either got to dive bomb right at it, or you've got to fly right over it. And when you have to do that, if there's defenses in the target area, it's a pretty good shot for a duck shooter to shoot an airplane down.
Colonel Summers, you know the disposition of the forces in Iraq, southern Iraq, and in Kuwait. You know, he has something like 4,000 tanks. He has 3,000 artillery pieces dug in there. You know, he has almost 400,000 troops dug in there. How long would it take in airstrikes, in the so-called air-land battle that this Pentagon has talked about so much, how long would it take to pummel them into submission?
Well, that's very hard to say. I mean, with any troops, you don't know how much shock they can take. I would say that the kind of devastating attacks they're going to get from the B-52s from the air will really try their morale and could very well break them, but we can't count on that. I think we've got to count on going in on the ground and taking them out. And if we're lucky and they do break and we don't have to do it, we're ahead of the game. But to try to plan a campaign to do it by air alone, I think is just foolish.
Okay.
Fred Francis?
Yeah, and Tom, I think what we're going to see over the next couple days is an attempt to break the Iraqi army on the ground. The rear troops, the Republican Guards divisions, approximately 150, 170,000 men and about 500 tanks, are going to be hard to break on the ground. Those guys aren't going to cut and run. I think the ones they'll concentrate on over the next couple of days are those green troops, the conscripts, the young kids in the front lines, and they do in fact expect those guys to break and give up. And that's not just wistful thinking on the part of the Pentagon. They have some intelligence to back that up. Over the last several months, there have been 400 defections of Iraqi troops. They've just walked across the border. Some of them have just come across the border into the Saudi army lines and asked for food, and they've been sent back. But approximately 400 of the Iraqi soldiers have come across, and they've told stories that there are 2 or 3 days supply of food and water, the morale is low, and they wanted to stay. So from the 400 defectors, U.S. intelligence gets the assessment that if they're pounded early and pounded quickly, that they might give up. So again, it's not totally wistful. There's some intelligence to back it up, but that's what they're counting on.
All right, Fred Francis, thanks very much. We're going to go now by audio report to Turkey, which has been an important ally for the United States in all of this, a member of NATO and a northern neighbor of Iraq. And Diana Kricki is standing by there tonight. Some important decisions being taken, I gather, in Turkey, Diana.
Yes, that's exactly right, Tom. In the early morning hours here, Turkey, the Prime Minister Akbulut did make a decision to throw Turkey's weight more solidly behind Operation Desert Storm. Akbulut announced that he will go to Parliament today to seek expanded war powers against Iraq. Basically, he is going to ask Parliament to approve the use for American fighters of Turkish bases to launch air raids against Iraq, even if Turkey is not attacked. Just a couple of days ago, Turkey was saying that American and European fighters here were strictly in a defensive mode and would only get into operation or launch raids if Turkey were attacked by Iraq. But in the early morning hours, that did change. Also, Akbulut is saying he would seek approval from Parliament that he would like Turkish soldiers to be able to take action across the border, the northern border of Iraq, in case of necessity, as he put it.
Okay, Diana Kricki, we're going to break away from Turkey right now because we're about to get, we think, the first video. It comes from a Pentagon-organized pool of what has been going on. We'll just show you a live picture of Saudi Arabia. Apparently, we do not yet have that. As Saudi Arabia looks like another takeoff from the Dhahran Air Base where Tornadoes were based, also F-15s, the first wings. Let's go now to Burbank, California. Brian Jenkins is well known to American television audiences now, former expert at the RAND Corporation on terrorism, now in the own private business. Brian, is there going to be a need to really step up security around the world as a result of all this?
Well, I think security has already been stepped up, but one of the key questions, even right now, is if a war began, whether Saddam Hussein would fight that war with an eye to his own survival after the war, that is, believing that he could sustain a defeat in Kuwait and still remain in power in Baghdad and emerge as a champion of the Arab people for having stood up to the Americans, or would he instead, like Samson in the temple, use all sorts of capabilities at his disposal, chemical weapons, missiles, and potentially a terrorist campaign? If the initial reports are right, he may have been deprived of some of that, some of those capabilities in terms of the chemical weapons, the missiles. The terrorism portion of it still remains a question mark.
Well, how good are the Iraqis, and as a curious way of putting it, I know, but how effective are they at organizing terrorist campaigns? We know about Abu Nidal, we know about the terrorist operations that have been launched from Syria in the past. Do the Iraqis have that kind of capacity as well?
Well, it doesn't require all that much to organize a terrorist campaign, depending on the targets one chooses. And we're not talking about terrorism in the form of sabotage, the more classic sense of sabotage, going after difficult targets, hard targets that will make a strategic contribution to the outcome of the war, but instead attacking undefended targets. That may require cold blood. It doesn't require a great deal of skill.
A lot of Americans who are watching this tonight are wondering, gosh, should I get on an airplane either in this country or if I were going to Europe? Is that a good idea? What would be your advice to them?
Well, I think there has been a bit of an overreaction. In fact, it's a demonstration of the effectiveness to a certain extent of terrorism or even the threat of terrorism. If we take terrorism to comprise not only the sum of terrorist actions, but the atmosphere of fear and alarm that is created by terrorist actions or even by the threat of terrorist actions, then in fact the war began in this country several days before the shooting began in the Middle East today. There is speculation about what terrorist targets might be. Security has been stepped up. People are frightened, but not a single terrorist has yet been cited.
And Bryant, what about Arabs around the world, especially those Arabs who are living in this country or who are visiting there? Do we treat them always as suspects?
I suppose that is an unfortunate but inevitable consequence. I think it's unfortunate, and it becomes particularly more pronounced if we do succumb to an atmosphere of fear and alarm and begin to divide the population into potential victims and potential fifth columns. I think it is inappropriate to treat every Arab American as if they are a potential terrorist. That really is the type of overreaction that I'd be concerned about.
Okay, Brian Jenkins, you're in private business now. Has that business activity stepped up? Are you hearing more from more and more American companies and companies around the world about your services?
Well, Kroll Associates is an international firm that has been involved for some years in providing investigative and consulting services to major corporations. Needless to say, since the invasion of Iraq, by Iraq of Kuwait, we have been involved in assisting our clients in dealing with the consequences of the events in the Middle East as it affects the private sector. Now, in the initial days, that had to do with issues of evacuation, security concerns, things of that sort. More recently, we have been trying to assist them in assess the post-war environment in which American corporations and European corporations will have to operate.
Thank you very much, Brian Jenkins, tonight with us from California. Former members of the Green Beret, served in Vietnam with distinction. Brian Jenkins went then to the Rand Corporation, where he made a study of terrorism around the world now in private business. So we just want to bring you briefly up to date based on what we know. It is now daytime in the Persian Gulf. It is about 8:30 in the morning in Iraq. There have been no additional reports of any attacks on military installations around the capital city of Baghdad, but we can presume that other military targets in that country and in Kuwait remain under attack from the air, primarily. Ground forces not yet engaged, although it does seem likely that at some point they probably will have to be used. To what degree, we cannot say at this hour. It is called Operation Desert Storm. It is a war that has been described as a war by stopwatch. We've been watching it tick off to the deadline. Tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, it was officially launched. We'll have continuing coverage right after this.
This is an Eyewitness News special report. War in the Persian Gulf.
Good morning. I'm Beverly Williams with this Eyewitness News special report. We will have a roundup of war-related events from the Delaware Valley and elsewhere. At 9 o'clock, President Bush went on television and radio to discuss Operation Desert Storm. He said the world could wait no longer.
This will not be another Vietnam. And I repeat this here tonight. Our troops will have the best possible support in the entire world, and they will not be asked to fight with one hand tied behind their back. We have no argument with the people of Iraq. Indeed, for the innocents caught in this conflict, I pray for their safety. Our goal is not the conquest of Iraq. It is the liberation of Kuwait.
The war began with missile and plane attacks on Baghdad and Kuwait. U.S., British, Kuwaiti, and Saudi Arabian Air Force units reportedly were involved. There are no reports of any pilots or planes being shot down. The first word of war in the Gulf interrupted everyday life for thousands of people across the Delaware Valley. At the Schubert Theater, a packed house was enjoying a new comedy when the bombing began. Theatergoers heard the news when the Schubert management played a tape of the president's speech during the intermission.
I can't even enjoy the show. I'm sitting there thinking about the people, our people's over there, and I'm trying to look at the show, trying to enjoy it at the same time, but it's kind of hard.
Well, it was expected. I mean, everything was pointing towards it. Sorry to hear it, though.
I have nephews, men friends, sons of girlfriends, and I have children that I knew from little all the way up that's going. I feel kind of bad.
The Gulf War touches all of us, but none more than families of those over there. Channel 3's Malcolm Poindexter visited a woman in Jenkintown shortly after the war broke out.
Well, did she call? Did she call yet?
Dawn Pinto fought back the tears as she answered the phone.
All right.
Her mother, Mary, is a captain with the 300th Field Hospital and arrived in Saudi Arabia only yesterday. Family members fear for her safety. Fears heightened by word of the air attack on Iraq and Kuwait.
I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I have all younger sisters and brothers, and they're all crying. They're really, really upset because they don't my younger brother and sister don't understand why this is happening and why their mother has to go over to Saudi Arabia.
Dawn's courage was bolstered by calls from friends and co-workers at Angeloni's Auto Collision Service. On the table in front of her, prayer candles burned all evening, and a yellow ribbon dramatized her prayer for a quick end to hostilities. Still fresh in her mind was seeing her mother off.
They were all in high spirits. They really were. And I think I was more nervous than she was. I really, you know, I was a nervous wreck yesterday. And I didn't even stay to see her off because I just couldn't handle it, really.
For Dawn Pinto and many others like her, it is now a waiting game, waiting to hear that their loved ones are safe and sound. From Jenkintown, Malcolm Poindexter, Channel 3, Eyewitness News Nightcast.
The start of war has sparked a cry for peace in Center City.
War! Stop the bombing! Stop the war! Stop the bombing!
Hundreds of people rallied tonight outside of the Liberty Bell on Independence Mall. The protesters are calling for an end to the war. The rally began as a small vigil and grew into a massive demonstration as the hours passed. Military bases in the Delaware Valley went into action immediately after the word of war. At McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, and Willow Grove Naval Air Station, the story was the same. Channel 3's Robin McIntosh reports on the scene from Willow Grove in Bucks County.
With the first word of war, dozens of servicemen and women reported for duty at Willow Grove Naval Air Station tonight. From the outside, operations appeared normal, but a closer look revealed security measures that included intensive searches of car and driver. Security is always tight here at Willow Grove, but tonight, security was extra tight. Every car pulling up to the front gate was met by a guard armed with a machine gun.
It's pretty much just checking cars as they go in and checking ID cards to make sure that everybody that's going in has a reason to go in.
Moments after word of Operation Desert Storm, Willow Grove was sealed to outsiders. Only military personnel were allowed in. The mood somber, but at the same time excited. The moment had finally come.
We're all hoping that this thing's over in a hurry and that everybody can go back to operations as normal and we'll have world peace again.
Operations are proceeding according to plan.
Across Route 611 from the base, the president's address stopped the work at Lee's Hoagie House as customers and employees hung on every word.
I just hope that we win, and I wish a lot of luck to the guys over there.
A lot of them are your customers.
Oh yeah, lots of them are. I took our hoagies to go.
Some of the customers here, Navy men, under strict orders not to talk to reporters, but others were clearly worried about the days ahead.
I think it's a long road, far further than any of us ever realized.
Tonight, the planes at Willow Grove are standing by, their crews trained and ready, hoping and praying for friends far away. In Montgomery County, I'm Robin McIntosh, Eyewitness News Nightcast.
Stay tuned to Channel 3 and KYW News Radio, 1060 on the dial, and NBC for all the latest on Operation Desert Storm. We will be back in a half an hour for an update on how the Delaware Valley is reacting to the war in the Middle East. I'm Beverly Williams. Now back to NBC and coverage of the United States at war.
They flew over from the United States with something like two or three refueling stops along the way. They eat up a lot of fuel as they're going there. The young pilots are just as you would expect them to be, kind of America's best and brightest. They are highly skilled, highly intelligent. They have what has been described as the right stuff. It still is an enormously complicated piece of business flying that kind of an airplane. They have a little heads-up screen right in front of them. It's a radar screen. They can lock on, as they describe it, any enemy aircraft that's coming at them, and then that locking on, once they activate their missiles, the missiles lock on the enemy aircraft. But they also have the capacity to go hand to hand, in a matter of speaking, to look down or to go against an airplane in the sky. This is the flight line. They're lifting off from there. Canopy in place. Adrenaline pump has got to be substantial, no matter how well trained you are in a moment like this. Flying off into the desert night. Target fixed. Capacity of the enemy not entirely clear. They'll fly at better than the speed of sound. They have enormous capacity for maneuvering. High drama at a desert base somewhere, we believe, in Saudi Arabia. Hard to know exactly where they're from. They may be from MacDill Air Force Base or from Langley in Virginia. Admiral Moranville, are you there? Fred, tell us about the capacity for the ordnance on board here. We've got missiles.
Yeah, these aircraft, these F-15 Eagles, will carry very little air-to-air missiles, very few Sidewinder missiles, but they'll carry very large bombs. What we're talking about basically are 2,000-pound bombs. We're talking about laser-guided smart bombs, which can lock onto target. One of these F-15 Eagles, Tom, will carry, just one small airplane will carry as much ordnance, as much explosives as one large bomber did in World War II. Obviously flying at faster than the speed of sound. And one thing I will tell you, Tom, this is the actual footage, the preparation before this operation was launched. Pools of reporters were brought out. They didn't know why they were being taken out to the base and kept there. And I believe this happened yesterday. They were brought out to the base. And of course, tonight getting ready for this operation. And we were told that American camera crews would be there when they got ready to make the strike into Iraq. And these F-15 Eagles, the F-15Es you're seeing here, are probably from Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. And I believe you met the commander of that squadron, Tom, Colonel William Broome.
Yeah, he is absolutely the right stuff. He was so good we thought the Air Force had invented him.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
He looks like a matinee idol. He's from Ohio. Silver gray hair at age 45. Total command of his troops and total loyalty. Let's say something about these ground crews as well, because they keep the planes flying and get them off the ground. Young men and women from all over the country.
They can turn one of these planes around, Tom. After an aircraft like this goes out and drops its ordnance, drops its bomb on a target that I might remind you has been selected a long time before this evening's operation. After the aircraft drop their ordnance, after they come back to base, these ground crews can turn those planes around in 15 minutes, fuel them, put new ordnance up, And that's why a few planes from a squadron like this, from Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, a few planes like this can fly several sorties in one night because of the way the ground crews turn them around. And actually, you're seeing them taxi out into the ramp for the taxiing out on the ramp now for the actual takeoff, going into the operation.
New arrangement now. The ground crews get to put their names on the airplanes as well, and they become bonded in a matter of speaking, not just to the airplane, but to the pilot. So it's a team, 3 people. Many of them were women. Many of the crew chiefs were women. And the woman who was in charge of taking care of the ordnance in the depot right next to the Dhahran Air Force Base was a very impressive woman, black woman it turns out, coincidentally, who ran all of these sergeants and young airmen, and Colonel Broom just could not have been prouder of her, and he made sure that we all went by to see that operation, which was at the same time not just crucial but delicate as well, because there was a lot of very explosive ordnance in that bunker.
Well, you know, of course, that this country has laws that say that women cannot be involved in combat. But in the kind of combat that we are seeing in the Persian Gulf tonight, Tom, these women are very much on the front line as those who are flying those aircraft when another country has missiles that it can fire. And that's I was going to say, that looked like a female crew chief right there.
Admiral Moranville?
Yes.
What kind of targets would these F-15Es have with their long-range capacity tanks on them?
Say the question again.
What kind of targets were they likely to have, these F-15Es?
Over there.
Well, they can hit any target that you want to send them after. They have the range when they carry the external tanks on the wings. You can extend the range of the aircraft to cover any targets you want to cover, and they have the capability to attack any target.
The difference between their capacity and, say, the stealth bomber? Describe that for us.
The F-15E will, and I don't know specific weights, but it'll carry an equivalent load to the stealth bomber. It'll take it considerably faster. The range is not a concern if you air refuel it, and they would do that.
Yeah, they were putting up tankers early tonight, like at 5 p.m. I think Eastern time, 2 hours before the actual attack itself. They were out and in position over the Gulf, we think.
I guess I could give you a better answer if I answered in this manner. If you're going to send an airplane at night and you're trying to achieve surprise in the mission, obviously the stealth bomber, if it can get in without being detected, can get over the target without getting shot and hit. Where an F-15E or any of the conventional airplanes wouldn't be able to do that, to achieve that kind of surprise. So if you needed to do that on a particular target, then obviously you'd send a stealth bomber.
Huh? Yeah, this is a 14.
Well, very similar.
Right. All right, I can tell you as someone who's ridden in the back seat of an F-15, it is, pardon me the expression, one hell of a ride. Those guys undergo an enormous amount of physical strain when they're up there as well, because it is so fast and so quick. The G-forces are enormous. You're in a pressure suit and you're pumping all the time, trying to keep the blood pumped up to the upper levels of your body. But to think about this, flying at Mach 1 or 2, Mach 1.1 or so, 800, 900 miles an hour, you're on a combat mission. You're looking at the radar. You got to fly the airplane at the same time. It's the dark of night, and anytime you make a turn, your body gets slammed effectively against what is only a steel seat behind you. There is no cushion there. It's like riding on a high-flying steel girder of some kind with this plane in which you are encased. And the people who can do that, think and fly and fire at the same time, are highly trained and have extraordinary hand-eye coordination. General Odom, one of the things that I learned, because I've been fascinated by this, is that they think that the new pilots are particularly good at the new electronics because they've grown up all their lives with electronic games, Nintendo and others, and they have very good touch when it comes to the electronics. So it's a new military we're talking about. It's a lot different than when you joined up.
We've been waiting for that video parlor game generation. I've heard a lot of talk about that, and I'm glad to hear a report that it is arriving on the scene.
Yep, that's what they say that does happen. Some of the stuff, as I say, that they fire on their own. Others is fired electronically, of course. They have a little tiny television set right in front of them. That's what it looks like. It's a radar screen, and it tells them a lot about what's going on out there. And, of course, they're being assisted, not just from the ground, but from the AWACS planes as well, telling them what is happening. All of that is computer-fed, and we'll see the results here tonight. So that is the situation now, based on what we have from Iraq. We'll tell you as well, there is a report out of Baghdad that we may be hearing from Saddam Hussein before too long on Iraqi television. There have been reports that he's already appeared on Iraqi radio, Baghdad radio, saying that he was describing President Bush as a hypocritical criminal. He was calling on the sons of Iraq to rise up and to do justice to their great cause against the disbelievers, as he has referred to those people in the West, which is ironic indeed. Speaking of hypocrisy, here is a man who was a decidedly secular leader. That's the description of all Arabists. He's a man who grew up in the Ba'athist Party, which was not a religious party at all, and he has killed people wantonly and willfully throughout his life. And now he invokes the name of Allah as the cause for this war. NBC's John Cochran is at the White House at this hour. John Cochran, everything's shut down there pretty much at the moment?
Pretty much shut down. Unfortunately, President Bush missed those remarkable pictures, but he has told his people to keep a video record of what does transpire. He'll see those pictures eventually. He'll be getting up shortly after dawn, and I think he'll be over at the Oval Office. My guess is probably certainly by 7 o'clock in the morning. And they had told him that he would be awakened at any hour if there are new developments. There apparently are not enough new developments, urgent developments, to require any decisions by him. The news is pretty good at this point, but we still don't have those, we don't have the bomb damage assessment reports. And that, of course, is the first thing he will want to know, to find out if these early reports are too pessimistic. There'll be a lot for him to do tomorrow. John Dancy, our chief diplomatic correspondent, was saying earlier, this has primarily become a Pentagon story and a White House story, and right now in Washington, at least, primarily a Pentagon story. There will be some diplomatic things for George Bush to decide. Diana Karicki reported earlier from Turkey on some developments there. We don't know, for example, whether or not it might be necessary for Turkey to be in a state of war with Iraq, because if in fact Turkey is being used as an air base for American jets to fly against the Iraqis, there's talk, in fact, of some kind of diplomatic effort to get a state of war between the two of them. A lot of rumors floating around, a lot of diplomatic stuff going on. George Bush will be on the phone tomorrow, obviously, to other allied leaders, possibly including to Mikhail Gorbachev. You know how he likes to work the phones. He'll be meeting with congressional leaders, most certainly, although he did officially notify them of what he was doing. Before we knew about it, he sent his Deputy National Security Advisor, Bob Gates, up to Capitol Hill between 6 and 7 p.m. Washington time this evening. And, of course, the first confirmed airstrikes in Baghdad were occurring just about that time. Tom.
Thank you very much, John Cochran. I'm here with Dr. Jonathan Fine, who is the Executive Director of the Physicians for Human Rights. He's literally just gotten off the airplane from Baghdad, where you have been over helping assess the capacity to treat the victims of any military attacks in your role as physician. What is the capacity for Iraq to deal with civilians who may be caught here in harm's way?
Extremely limited. With Dr. Carl Taylor, Johns Hopkins, I visited 3 children's hospitals there. They're virtually out of some of the most vital medicines and equipment. They don't have the intravenous infusion apparatus for babies. There's been no baby milk in that country for some months now. Mothers are feeding their children rice water in some cases. They don't have antibiotics. They're going to have some epidemic diseases when sewerage mixed with water after bombs break those mains. It's a pretty grim situation.
And what is there that can be done to assist them? The Red Cross in any fashion?
Well, certainly there's a lot that could be done through the international community, the Red Cross, UNICEF, and if the United Nations realizes that we have a continuing humanitarian obligation to the civilians who are really innocent bystanders, and they probably will take 80% of the casualties.
Dr. Plant, why do you think that the Iraqi government has not been more attentive to those kinds of health needs?
Frankly, I don't think Saddam Hussein is very concerned about his civilians. I mean, he gave an interview over the weekend to a high-level Islamic figure and said he estimated 500,000 of his own military would die and 100,000 Americans would die, but he failed to mention any civilian casualties. I don't think it's much of a factor with him.
What is it that you could do for him? Could you give advice? Did you tell him places where, not Saddam Hussein, but the health people that you were meeting with there? What is it that you could do to help them, or are you doing it here by talking about it?
Sure. I think no, both, really. We feel that there have to be, under humanitarian law, and for obvious reasons, vaccines have to get in there, life-saving antibiotics, and even the soldiers of the Iraqi army are entitled to care for their wounds. And children and women especially need to be cared for. They have almost no way of doing this. They've got 250 burn beds in Baghdad, a city of 4 million, according to one of their ministers we spoke to. They've got 300 beds in Baghdad for acute trauma. And they're not going to cope without a lot of outside assistance, whether it comes from the UN or some other way. We have that obligation to civilians in any conflict, regardless of their nationality.
So once this military campaign is over, and everyone hopes that it will be over very swiftly, then the United States has a moral obligation, in your judgment, as well as it will help itself politically by stepping in there as quickly as possible to offer that kind of compassionate aid.
No question. And if it's a prolonged conflict, we really don't know. There have to be arrangements to get vital medicine in there, medical equipment, even during the conflict.
All right, Dr. Fine, thank you very much for being with us. We know that you have had a long and trying ordeal, but it's an important mission that you were on as well, and thanks for sharing that story tonight.
Pleasure.
We have now some very recent video from the Pentagon pool. These are F-15s taking off from an undisclosed air base in Saudi Arabia. We think they're from the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing in Virginia. They were heavily loaded with ordnance and fuel. They could penetrate, therefore, deep into Iraq. They have the carrying capacity of, even though they're a high-performance fighter attack plane, they have the carrying capacity when it comes to bombs and weapons of a World War II vintage bomber, and almost as good as a stealth bomber in terms of what they can carry. This is a member of the ground crew. This is the first time that we're seeing this material, and so it has not been edited in any way. But that young man's face tells you a lot about the troops on the ground over there. They barely look old enough to be in high school, much less to be outrunning this kind of a sophisticated military machine and launching an attack against Iraq in the desert. They are the young men. It's still true, old men make the decisions, young men fight the battles, although there are a lot of young women there as well these days. Fred Francis, you're watching all of this.
Now, Tom, as happens on occasions like this, former fighter pilots call in and tell you that that was their old unit, and the jets we were seeing about to take off there were from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, not Langley in Virginia. I was told to look for the SJ on the back of the wing, and of course, virtually every tactical fighter squadron in the country, I'm told there are only about 20 squadrons left in the entire United States. Virtually every tactical fighter squadron in the country is either in Saudi Arabia or one of the surrounding countries. And the pool footage that we have seen, and these men here, according to the phone call I just received, are from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and I believe that's in North Carolina. Tom?
Okay, Fred Francis, that's the latest audio that we are, and video that we are getting from there. Let's go to Detroit now. Detroit is a city, I think it's kind of the unofficial Middle Eastern capital of the United States. A lot of Arab Americans have emigrated to that area over the years, Palestinians, Lebanese, people from Egypt as well, and also from Iraq. And NBC's Lucky Severance is there tonight.
Tom, I'm with Osama Sablini, who is publisher of the largest Arab American paper outside of the Middle East. We're in Dearborn, a suburb of Detroit. I think there are about 250,000 Arab Americans here. Is that right?
That is correct, Lucky.
You're putting out a special edition tonight, and from the tears I've seen on some of the workers' faces tonight, this will not be an edition rejoicing or attacking Iraq.
Well, of course not. It is what's happening today, and the Arab Americans are watching events unfolding in the Middle East. It would be the major catastrophe that in our modern time. We are angry and we are disappointed that our country, the United States, is involved in a war against our people overseas.
You don't think the U.S. should have done anything?
I think the United States could have done a lot of things. I think diplomacy was not exhausted. We did not see it as exhausted as they claim that they have. Many things could have been done to avert war.
You feel as if you're a victim of both Saddam Hussein and President Bush.
Well, like I said earlier to you, Lucky, that we feel like we are sodomized and ambushed at the same time. And all what we have to do right now is pray to God and ask God only to help us to go through this major catastrophe that we're witnessing these days.
If the U.S. wins this, is this winning the battle or is this winning the war? What's going to happen after, in your view?
I think it's winning only a small battle. I think we will lose the war. I think we'll have 200 million Arabs on our back for at least the next 4 decades. We have a great animosity in the Arab world against this country's foreign policy and the way it has conducted itself in the past. I believe that this will have a backlash against the United States and the American people overseas.
Might there also be a backlash against Arab Americans if, in fact, there are incidents of terrorism in this country? Are you worried about that?
I am worried. I'm extremely worried about this, but I'd like to assure everybody that Arab Americans ran away from violence and from terrorism. And if there is anybody there that's hiding somewhere and the Arab American community know about it, they would be the first one to tell the FBI and the first one to tell the authorities.
Didn't you mention earlier that there were some incidents of vandalism in some of the stores that some of the Iraqis own? The Iraqis own, I think, like 90% of the supermarkets and the stores here.
Well, as a matter of fact, just before we got on the air, Lucky, we just received a phone call, just before we got on the air, from a guy from Saudi Arabia who owns a gas station in Detroit that has been, somebody shot at his gas station and vandalized his gas station, and he called the police and the man was arrested. So we have this kind of things that's going to go on, but we hope that our American citizens, the fellow citizens, non-Arabs, realize that Arab Americans are human beings and they have feelings, and there are a lot of anger there, and they're worried. They are watching with worried.
Okay, thank you very much, Osama Sablini. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Lucky. Thank you, Doctor. We have some additional material now coming out of the Persian Gulf. This is the first pool material that we're seeing from the front. These are the gas mask and chemical outfits. A drill, apparently, as they prepare for what effectively was the decision moment to launch an attack from the air. So far as we know, ground forces have not yet been involved. This was the continuing and terrifying prospect for anyone who went into the Persian Gulf area, that somehow Saddam Hussein would be able to launch a chemical attack. Crude weapons, they don't have to be very accurate because the chemicals would then permeate the air. It would probably be launched by his Scud missiles. The American Patriot missile was sent over there to shoot it down. This is a drill designed to show how quickly these men have to get their chemical suits out and their gas masks on. And it was an arduous exercise indeed. If there had been a chemical attack, any number of people who went through this experience wondered how many could possibly survive it. And many people didn't have the chemical suits, they only had the gas mask. When I was there with President Bush, for example, the reporters accompanying him, we were all given the gas mask but not the chemical suits, and we didn't know how we could survive one and be exposed to the other. We'll have continuing coverage here from the Persian Gulf right after this.
This is an Eyewitness News special report. War in the Persian Gulf.
Good morning, I'm Steve Bell. On this Eyewitness News special report, we'll have a roundup of war-related events from the Delaware Valley and elsewhere. Just last week, President Bush got the go-ahead from Congress to launch tonight's war. 2 local lawmakers who took part in that historic action spoke with us tonight.
Very tough proposition to cast the vote, which I did last Saturday, which had a lot of consequences with it.
Well, it's a very solemn and sad moment. The war that we thought we could avoid
is now underway, and our prayers and our thoughts are with those young people who are over there in Saudi Arabia representing the United States who are locked in combat. Our prayers are with their family.
For families of the men and women now in combat, this has been a particularly trying night. Channel 3's Barbara Monaco was with a Delaware County serviceman's family as they got news about the Gulf War.
Alice Burke bit her lip with anxiety as she listened to the president speak. She has grave reason to fear. Her son, Marine Sergeant Michael Burke, is an infantryman, and he is on the front line. Burke's family gathered round her, trying to bolster her spirit and theirs. But as the president ended his speech, Alice Burke had to release the tears.
And may he continue to bless our nation.
She told me she's proud of her son and his mission, but that doesn't make this any easier to bear.
When you hear before he did it, it's upsetting. But I know they're there now, but now I'm going to think, I'll constantly be listening to when are they moving the ground troops, because I know he's on the forward line there, and so I know he's going to go. I know he's going to go.
The Burke family is committed to the conflict, but they have this thought and prayer, that it will be over quickly with little loss of life. Barbara Monaco, Channel 3, Eyewitness News.
Almost immediately after the announcement that war had begun, anti-war protesters began gathering at Independence Mall.
No blood for wars! No blood for wars! No blood for wars! No!
The chant, "No blood for oil," heard from hundreds of protesters, many of them students. At one point, Market Street in front of the Liberty Bell was blocked by the demonstration. Police quickly cleared the street and no arrests were made. At this hour, protesters remain outside Independence Mall and the demonstration remains peaceful. Security is at an all-time high at military bases across the country. Guards at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey carefully checking the IDs of everyone entering the base. McGuire and other U.S. military bases could become the targets of terrorist attacks now that war is underway. The start of war shot the price of oil up to $40 a barrel. It also created chaos on stock markets that were still open. This the frantic trading scene on the Chicago Stock Exchange immediately after war began. The price of crude oil climbed $9 a barrel, but then fell back a bit later. On the Philadelphia Stock Exchange tonight, trading also wild. The exchange chairman isn't surprised by the flurry of activity.
There isn't much unanticipated for the initial wave of attacks. Tomorrow will bring us new information as to the success or failure of that first wave. That will move the markets again.
Several major oil companies have frozen the price of gasoline for the time being, and President Bush ordered 33 million barrels of oil from the nation's strategic stockpile offered for sale on oil markets. He hopes to stabilize the market. Stay tuned to Channel 3, NBC, and KYW News Radio 1060 for all the latest on Operation Desert Storm. I'm Steve Bell. Now let's rejoin NBC News and coverage of the United States at war.
Colonel Rudlin, a Marine colonel from Watertown, South Dakota, was in charge of the operation, and I think he brought in something like 6 ships and had them offloaded and on the docks and then out to the desert within the first 5 days or so. They were working around the clock. It was one of the most impressive logistical exercises that anyone could imagine. And while those tanks were on those ships over that 2-year period, they would take them off from time to time, change the oil, check the treads, make sure that everything was lubricated, put them back on, and just await an occasion quite like this. We'll be back with more after this.
From NBC News, America at War continues. Here is Tom Brokaw.
We're back now, and I'm Tom Brokaw. We are awaiting an update from the Pentagon and the possibility of a radio or television address by Saddam Hussein, whose country has been under attack now for some 6 hours altogether. It began at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time Wednesday. In the Persian Gulf, it was in the middle of the night. In Iraq, military targets were hit in and around Baghdad and in other parts of that country. Also, military targets came under attack in Kuwait, we are told. So far, all the early reports indicate that it has been going very well for the United States and allied forces, but we have to await a further evaluation of that. Early reports from Baghdad indicated that command and control centers were especially hard hit. Radar was taken out. They would control some of the Iraqi missiles. We do not believe that any of the Scud missiles got up. That was the weapon that was feared most of all. The Iraqi Air Force may have been destroyed, but we still cannot say for sure if that's the case. Some of those planes could be in bunkers. Israel, which had worried that it would come under attack as soon as the first shot was fired at Iraq, is breathing somewhat easier tonight. How the rest of the Arab world will react to all of this, we cannot say, because this war still goes on. Even though ground forces have not yet been engaged, they could be before too long. NBC's Fred Francis at the Pentagon. Fred?
Tom, I do not think, based on everything that we have learned at the Pentagon today and in the preceding weeks, that Phase 2, which is the ground war, is near to us. Everything we have learned is that for 3 to 10 days, the United States plans to pound, and that's the word that's used in this building, pound targets, strategic targets, chemical, biological, nuclear targets, tanks, artillery, just pound the Iraqi military for 3 to 10 days. The plan is that they will, at the end of that period, make the determination whether U.S. ground forces will have to go into Kuwait to root out the 500,000 troops that are there. And so that's Phase 2. And based on everything we've been able to learn, Phase 2 is still 10 days off. Tom?
NBC's Fred Francis at the Pentagon. We've been checking in with you all night long, and we will continue to do that. We'd like to go to Ed Rabel now, who is in London, where there has been an emergency meeting of NATO tonight, and Ed is there with Paul Beaver, who represents Jane's Defense Weekly. For the cognoscenti, there is no better publication in terms of knowing what's available to forces around the world and how they may be used. Ed, before we get to Mr. Beaver, give us an update on what the American ambassador said to the other NATO foreign ministers.
Yes, Tom, some interesting messages coming out of that Brussels meeting tonight. There seems to be a willingness now by the United States to end hostilities toward Iraq. Tonight, U.S. Ambassador to NATO William Taft told the 16-nation alliance the goal of the overnight air raids, quote, was not to occupy or dismember Iraq, but to liberate Kuwait, a statement from the U.S. mission at NATO tonight. And then there was also a report out of Brussels that NATO has unanimously agreed to defend Turkey in case that country is attacked. We do have Paul Beaver here, and we want to talk to him tonight about the amazing strikes on Iraq. Were they the success of those strikes, did they surprise you?
Yes, I think everybody must have been surprised by the fact that at least the first waves of strike aircraft from the US Air Force, the United Kingdom Royal Air Force, the Royal Saudis, and the Free Kuwaitis, all the aircraft seem to have got back without any casualties at all. And I think that's quite an incredible feat.
Well, why do you suppose this happened? I mean, to say Saddam Hussein's Air Force did have some fighters that could fly and fight at nighttime. That is a formidable army he has put together over the past 10 years. What happened?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? You would have thought that so close to the United Nations deadline that his air defences would be at their highest state of alert. It doesn't appear that that was the case, and we don't have any firm details of that. I think it perhaps shows that for some reason the command and control system wasn't functioning for whatever reason, and certainly there's no indication of any air defense fighters being launched by the Iraqis in trying to save or trying to defend Baghdad and other targets. It's not just Baghdad, of course. It's the targets. It includes missile sites in the west of Iraq, and of course we understand down in Kuwait as well.
Any sense of the expertise that you might have on the question of how reliable Saddam Hussein's officers in the command and control structure might have been, or whether it was United States strikes that took out the command and control structure. Any sense of that?
Yes, I think certainly from what Secretary Cheney has said, what General Powell has said, and also, of course, President Bush, if you put all of their statements together and the official statements that are coming out of the Pentagon, it does seem that the initial targets for the coalition, for air forces, were the command and control centers, the telecommunication centers, the air defense systems. And so I suppose really following standard doctrine these days, these are usually the targets that people go for. So it could well be that they were totally disorientated by the strike. I think it just is a remarkable feat. It shows just how professional modern air forces are or can be if they've got the proper training.
What was the expectation in terms of the losses that the United States and the Allied forces might have had in the air out there in the Gulf tonight?
I think certainly in terms of first strike, there were expected to be casualties. We don't know, of course, exactly what the situation is with further strikes. So we understand that for the first 4 hours there were continuous aerial bombardments and manned aircraft strikes. We don't know if all of those aircraft have returned safely. We just hope that they have.
Well, if Iraq decides to continue and not to pull out of Kuwait, what is the next phase in the air war?
I think we're going to see continued operations. Certainly from what President Bush has said this evening and what the Pentagon has been telling us, that this is not just a flash in the pan from their point of view. They are actually prepared to have continuous operations, and after all, there are 1,200 or so strike aircraft and combat aircraft available to the coalition forces, so they could maintain around-the-clock aerial bombardment.
Tom?
Ed Rabel tonight with Paul Beaver, who is with Jane's Defense Weekly, and as you can tell, these are the people who have continuing expertise about capacity and what can be done there. In this country we can only guess has been riveted by what has been going on in the Persian Gulf as we have waited collectively for the countdown to what turned out to be a war after all, a war called Operation Desert Storm. NBC's Keith Morrison tonight has been taking a look at how America has been watching and listening and waiting and praying.
Tom, we certainly, Tom, expected something might happen, but yet when it happened today, a lot of people didn't quite know what to think. It hit them in the stomach. There was that kind of reaction that comes when great or terrible events occur. We sat very quietly and looked at television screens and didn't quite know what to say at the beginning. Here's what we found.
Everywhere, though they knew it was coming, was a kind of shock.
Well, actually, I heard it on my car radio, then came on in here and watched it on the news.
People gathered around places where information could be had, any place, trying to comprehend what was happening. First reactions?
It's a tragedy. It's a bad thing that happens, and it's a bad thing, actually. And I feel sad for the whole thing.
Well, there's nothing really we can do right now. I just hope that there aren't that many casualties on our side, and all we can do is just watch the news right now. Just pray.
At a military base east of Los Angeles, troops preparing for service in the Gulf heard the radio, listened, silent.
Action around Baghdad. Apparently there's anti-aircraft fire going on.
And then this from an officer.
I'm sorry it happened because there's going to be a lot of innocent people die because of one man.
From an enlisted man.
Well, it was one of my worst fears, but yeah, you know, it's come true and now we have to face it.
In San Francisco, opponents of the war heard the news and were furious.
All we need to do is stop the war!
And even as they began to march, a screaming headline hit the streets. And by nightfall, downtown San Francisco rang with the shouts of demonstrators saying this is wrong.
We say no!
I think we should pull the troops out now. I think this is the biggest mistake Bush has made.
In Albuquerque, Rosemary Brackett, with a son in the Gulf, spoke from the other side of a wide spectrum.
Oh, I think they should be supported 1,000,000%. And those protesters just drove me. I was so angry with those protesters.
In Los Angeles, Al and Norma Jacobs, whose son is now at war, spoke sadly about a conflict they publicly opposed and now hope will end quickly.
I don't really think the peace demonstrations hurt him. I was for a peaceful solution to the war. But since the war started, there's nothing I can do but support the the effort right now.
This day has been hardest, of course, for the families, for mothers whose very human feelings are now in such a crisis.
Moms are here to try to help and make things better. This mom can't make this any better. And that's the hardest thing. I feel bad that I can't help him.
And this was the first day, first hours, during which nerves and stomachs were rolling for many. They took what comfort they could.
That last was a picture from an all-night prayer vigil which is being held in Pasadena. We sent our cameras out throughout the western United States, but there was reaction obviously all across the country. We have all been riveted by what has gone on. And we have still disagreed, even after the decision by President Bush, after the announcement that war had begun. There was a clash between anti-war and pro-administration demonstrators in Washington. There were demonstrations in Los Angeles, demonstrations around the campus of UCLA, and reports that tomorrow UCLA students will go on strike. So the anti-war feeling has not disappeared, and yet as the day progressed, Tom, you could see that public opinion about what had happened was changing rapidly. Continues to change rapidly. One gets the impression, again, as we get reports back from our crews. But where it's going to go tomorrow, I guess heaven only knows. We'll just have to watch.
Keith Morrison, thank you very much. That is reflective, I'm sure, of the feelings in the country. A wide range of emotions. Everything from people saying this is something that we must do, to people reacting with shock and horror. But now the operation does continue. Before too long, we should be getting some intelligence assessments, I would think. They'll be able to get some satellite photographs out from there. They'll be able to make some visual, I would think, inspections as well of what is going on in those areas where there were some crucial military sites that were attacked. Command and Control Center, CNC, we've been using that phrase again and again. That's generally a bunker. It's generally where the people who run the Iraqi military operations would be located with all of their electronic gear. They want to shut that down so there is confusion in the field. So those forces that are out there won't know what to do, A, and B, won't know whether they have been cut off from the rest of the world altogether. In Saudi Arabia, NBC's Arthur Kent and Mike Betcher standing side by side now with an update on the situation there. Arthur, let's begin with you.
Tom, in the last hour, we've seen about 18, perhaps 20 U.S. F-15 interceptors take off from here, and also a flight of 12 Kuwaiti aircraft, A-4 Skyhawks, the aircraft that managed to get away when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The Kuwaiti aircraft can't fly at night. This may, in fact, be their first sortie. They were bearing long-range tanks under the aircraft belly, and they took off in the direction of their homeland, Kuwait, and Iraqi forces there. Mike?
Art, ever since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and since the first day of the planning for Operation Desert Shield, which has become Operation Desert Storm, everyone wondered how Iraq would react if there was an attack.
Saudi Arabia braced for a counterattack. Across the kingdom, air raid sirens warned civilians and soldiers to take cover. Scud missiles had been detected in the air and heading towards Saudi Arabia. There was a rush to the bomb shelters. Refuge was sought in basements. Protection would be provided by chemical suits. People in Saudi Arabia had been warned that in the event of an attack against Iraq, Saddam Hussein would probably retaliate with chemical weapons. The warning was taken seriously. American soldiers took cover too. All the time, they kept their weapons loaded and ready. After it became clear that no missiles had reached this location in eastern Saudi Arabia, the all-clear was given.
There is no real threat here yet.
A rush of sound and a dot of fire against the moonless night were proof that American and British fighter jets were in the air and conducting combat operations. Early reports indicated that their missions were successful.
All aircraft returned safely. Operations continue.
In the lobby of a hotel near an important American air base in northeast Saudi Arabia, Muslims faced Mecca and prayed to Allah. One of them was a Kuwaiti refugee who hoped to be returning home soon.
I feel very, very comfortable.
If early reports of the success of the Desert Storm operation are correct, his prayers might indeed be answered.
It may be some time before he knows if his prayers are indeed answered, and it will probably be even more time before we know if Iraq has the capability to still launch a counterattack against Saudi Arabia after tonight's action. Tom?
Mike Betcher and Arthur Kent, thanks very much. What are you hearing from the American military officers who have been assigned to you as information officers? Are you getting, in fact, any information from them?
Tom, we're still in the infancy of this operation, and the public affairs officers have been very tight-lipped all night. They've been eager to point us toward Riyadh and toward Washington for information, not too forthcoming with any solid information on the ground here. We are, of course, pressing. Unfortunately, it's an overcast sky today, a bit cloudy, and Mike, we haven't been able to see or count or verify returning aircraft coming back from Kuwait.
And this business of the Defense Department pools and the video that we have seen so far, mostly of fighter planes taking off and some ground troops in a forward position. Have you heard from any of the people assigned to the pool? For example, your colleague Brad Willis, has he checked in at all?
We haven't heard from Brad yet. Gary Matsumoto, another correspondent, was activated sometime last night. We understand he is coming back from an air base, and we should be able to talk to him. Brad Willis, Jeff Riggins, the cameraman, Peter Sanson, the sound man, we have not heard from them for a day, but they're with the Marines. We're sure they're okay, but no word from those pools. All we're seeing are takeoffs and landings and minor things at the present time.
Tom, if I may, Mike, it's striking in that here today, as this major operation is underway, we feel very much in the hands of the U.S. military. Our people, our camera people, sound people, correspondents are taken from us, literally scrambled as the aircraft are, sent to destinations unknown, not of our choosing. Certainly we're interested in reporting fully everything we can, but it's more or less a case of the U.S. military deciding where they will take us and what window on this operation they will provide us.
All right, gentlemen, and tell me about the Saudis. There has been a sizable contingent around the hotel there from the Saudi government, of course. Adil Al-Jaber, who is from the Prince Bandar staff, and other people there who've been trying to help you. Are you hearing from them now at all?
We heard earlier from them about the fact of the launchings of Scud missiles towards Saudi airspace, and the really only substantial report we've had so far from them was that at that time no Scud missile had reached Saudi airspace. Later on, it seems that Scud missiles did come into Saudi territory. We're still trying to get a complete confirmation on that. But at the present time, not a lot of information coming out on Saudi television at the present time. There are speeches, patriotic music being played, pep talks. Saudi commanders are now speaking to the nation. It was pre-recorded material of them saying that they were winning this war and trying to get the spirit of the nation up. They're trying to reassure the nation, but very little hard information right now, Tom.
Thank you very much, Mike Betcher and Arthur Kent in Saudi Arabia. We have some late pictures, I think, from the Defense Department pool over there. Most of the pictures that we have seen so far have been on the ground and at night. This, again, is another Air Force base, and we do not know. Those appear to be very recent because they're daytime photos. One of the big cargo planes that could be carrying troops or material, as you can see the desert dunes in the background. I think what we're looking at here, I'm not an expert on this kind of stuff, but I think what we're looking at here are F-16s now. It's a different craft with a single rudder. Fred, help me out with that.
That's right. Those were F-16s, right, which were not used in the night assault because most F-16s cannot attack at night, and landing behind the F-16 in the background was an Air Force C-130. Right. And here you're looking at ordnance bombs, which will be laced up underneath those bombers, and these look to be. I'm not quite sure what that is. It looks to be like an F-111 or an F-15 there, and get a closer look.
Yeah, it's too big for an F-15. It's probably
that's
an F-111.
right. That's an F-111 bomber, and that looks like a 2,000-pound bomb there. And it also has some other missiles laced up underneath the wing here, Tom. And the turnaround time on these things is 15 or 20 minutes, and obviously this was there don't seem to be any great urgency putting these things on. Most of these, that's a laser-guided smart bomb there. And the way that works, Tom, is that from the belly of the F-111, a laser locks onto the target. And once there's a lock-on to a target on the ground, the bomb is released, and it follows the laser into the target. And if you'll remember that dramatic video of the F-111 bombers dropping their bombs on the airport in Tripoli, Libya, that's how that was done, with the laser locking onto the target and the bomb following it in. And they are reputed to be so accurate that they can hit a target within 15 feet of that laser lock-on. And of course, that didn't happen in Libya. There's a great downfall to this type of weapon, Tom, that if there's any dust, serious dust in the air, or serious smoke in the air, or serious bomb debris from the previous bomb, the laser lock-on is broken. And that's how the French embassy was hit in Tripoli with one of those bombs. And again, that appears to be an F-111 getting ready.
Yeah, well, now we've just taken another look at an F-16 out there. We don't know where this air base is, obviously. These are pictures that have been released by the Defense Department. They've had a very tight rein on American reporters and their ability to move around. In Saudi Arabia, they're releasing just exactly what they wanted to. We have yet to receive anything that looks like the attack taking place, although there was one earlier picture of some F-15s taking off. General William Westmoreland once complained, in his words, that Vietnam was the first war fought without any censorship, and as a result, things got terribly confused in the public mind. That was not lost on this generation of military leaders. Go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. There's been a real war fought here at the Pentagon in Washington over just what rules would prevail over the coverage of that we're seeing right now. Over the last 2 to 3 weeks, the bureau chiefs of the major news organizations fought the Pentagon down from 6 pages of rules to 1 page, and but never got what they really wanted, the bureau chiefs and the major news organizations, and that was complete unilateral coverage where news organizations could just send their men up to the front lines.
Yeah, it's not entirely a joke out there in Saudi Arabia with the guys who did serve in Vietnam, mostly of officer rank. They say duty, honor, and hate the media. And it was, they said it with a tight little smile when they were talking to you about it. And in fairness, 1 or 2 of them had been burned occasionally, but they're there to do a mission, and they don't want the military to get as damaged as it was in Vietnam, in which, in too many instances, and this is understandable from their point of view, they're sensitive to this, the military became a kind of societal pariah. That, too, was unfair. Yeah,
exactly, Tom. Tom, a point about the bomb you're seeing right here and the targets that those bombs may well be used against today. Sources tell NBC News that there is a concern at the Central Command headquarters and here at the Pentagon and the administration that Saddam Hussein has hidden some of his missile systems. And over the last several weeks, U.S. intelligence has some evidence that what Saddam Hussein's very good combat engineers have done is dig deep holes in the earth, holes large enough to drive a trailer truck into, and then have covered up those holes and have hidden mobile Scud missiles in those trenches. And that's what these bombs will go after.
Fred, we've got a late report out of Nicosia, Cyprus again. This is a monitoring radio out of Iraq. Military command from Iraq said Thursday that civilian and military facilities had been hit in the massive U.S.-led airstrikes. The enemy planes only hit the targets that God wanted, whatever that means. So we'll talk about that later. We'll be back with continuing coverage after this. We're back. You're looking at Defense Department pool pictures now of the loading of heavy armaments on the bottom of what we think is maybe an F-16 at an undisclosed location somewhere in Saudi Arabia. The F-16s were not used in the nighttime attacks. F-15s were the principal planes, probably along with stealth bombers, as they penetrated deep into Iraq from the Saudi desert and hitting military targets in and around Baghdad, also in other parts of Iraq. And we were told early on, although we've heard no more about this, military targets in Kuwait as well. So far, all the reports back are that it has gone reasonably well. In fact, from the Pentagon's point of view, it has gone extremely well, Operation Desert Storm. The Israelis have been relieved and impressed by the damage that was done to the Scud missile sites in Iraq. That was a great fear that they would be launched against Israel, and then possibly the whole Arab world would become involved against the United States and the Western alliance that had been so carefully stitched together over there. That did not happen. There has been no counterstrike that we know of at all on the part of the Iraqi forces. What capacity they have, what Saddam Hussein has in mind, it's impossible to tell. Sunrise, as you can see. Fred Francis?
Yes, I'm told that the bombs we were looking at were not laser-guided smart bombs, but cluster bombs. And cluster bombs are the type of munition that when dropped from those aircraft explode hundreds of tiny bomblets before they hit the ground. Very often used for anti-personnel purposes, also used to destroy radar and destroy anti-aircraft sites. If you can't hit the anti-aircraft guns on the ground precisely, then you can drop one of these cluster bombs, and it will cover, one bomb will cover 2 football fields with little bomblets. And that's what they were loading on those aircraft.
Fred, I have some additional information now from Iraq on what Saddam Hussein has been saying on We Think Baghdad radio. He vowed that, quote, the mother of battles had just started in the Gulf. Going on, and again quoting from Saddam Hussein, at least as we get this radio report, the traitors began their attack at 2:30 a.m. on the night of January 16th, 17th. That's the right time. The cowards attacked us with treachery, said a message from Iraqi president, read on the official Baghdad radio. Satan Bush, U.S. President George Bush that he's talking about, and criminal Zionism, a reference to Israel, have committed their crimes. The mother of battles has started between the forces of evil and justice. Justice will win, he said, with the help of God. The criminals have failed. Saudi King Fahd, the traitor of the Islamic holy sites, the traitor of the Arab and Islamic nations, will be a loser, he said. The courageous Iraqis who carry the torch of Islam will emerge victorious. The thrones of the traitors will soon fall when the will of the Satan of the White House breaks. Palestine, Lebanon, and the Golan Heights will be liberated. Gary Sick is with me right now. As we read all of this, he's really cranked up the rhetoric here.
Yes, he has. Of course, what he doesn't say in there is how he could have been so incredibly unprepared for what the incompetence that is demonstrated on this, I must say, is astonishing. Not to take anything away from our forces, but the fact that he had 5 months to know that this was going on and had not a single missile ready to fire when this moment came is really rather astonishing.
Well, and speaking of hypocrisy, for this man to invoke God and to suddenly to see himself as the protector of the holy sites when he has been a secular and immoral leader, the only way to describe him from a political point of view, all of his adult life, he got to power through the barrel of a gun and worse, and that's how he maintains power there.
Now, the kind of torture and repression that go on in that society speak for themselves. It is this kind of bluster what we're hearing now on the radio, and I think it really is bluster. In fact, I must say that the statement that we got from the military forces, saying that the enemy planes only hit the targets that God wanted, is a pretty lame excuse for the fact that they were really unable to protect all of their major sites.
Gary Sick, we're looking at Defense Department pictures and hearing the words as we read them to you as they've been described to us of Saddam Hussein. Back in a moment.
From NBC News, America at War continues. Here
is Tom Brokaw.
It is called Operation Desert Storm, and it has been underway primarily in the air for now 6.5 hours. It began at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. These are some Defense Department pictures, pool videotape they're called. DOD stands for Department of Defense, provided for us as the planes are loaded with the armaments. It was primarily an air attack that was launched tonight against military targets in Kuwait and in Iraq. So far as we know, they have been very effective. There has been no counterstrike that we can determine now from Iraq so far. There were earlier reports that some Scud missiles may have been launched, and then an indication that those reports were in fact in error. So far, no signs of any kind of chemical warfare. So no signs of the Iraqi Air Force in the air, and no ground forces moving toward the Saudi border, where there is an enormous grouping of American ground forces aided by Arab allies as well as British forces on the ground as well. As of this hour, American ground forces, we do not think have been used, but it is likely that at some point they may have to cross the border. To what extent, we cannot say. It really depends on the success of this air campaign, which is going on. We believe, however, that at the moment there's an assessment underway on the part of the American intelligence defense groups. That would include the CIA and others. They'll want to see how much damage was done. They'll want to see where they want to go next to see if they can't bring Saddam Hussein to his knees. So that's the situation at this hour in Saudi Arabia as we watch those missiles being launched. I think that one is air-to-air, isn't it, Fred?
That's air-to-air, Tom, and you and I would have flunked the plane identification test. The earlier aircraft were F-15s. These are F-15 Eagles, which have a ground attack mode. There are anti-armor cluster bombs being loaded, Sidewinder missiles. I'm not sure what kind of missile this is right here, a standard missile, a longer range air-to-air missile. Obviously, the F-15 Eagle can both attack on the ground and also attack in the air. Yeah. And the interesting thing here, Tom, is that these pictures were taken sundown yesterday in somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and that appears to be a good 9 hours before 8 to 9 hours before the attack. So the preparation was going on all day yesterday, getting these aircraft ready to go.
Well, the quick way I can tell the difference is that if they've got twin rudders at the back, then it's probably an F-15, and I didn't see that at the beginning, but we will take any correction those fighter pilots are calling in, and I know that they're calling in.
Believe me, Tom, these phones are real busy here. Every time we make a mistake on the air, we're corrected.
No, I know. There's nothing more sensitive, and I do not, even though I've been up in the back seat of one of them, I do not pretend to be an expert, in part because I think that my heart was in my throat most of the time that I was on the flight.
Tom, let's go back to the terrible business of day 2 of this war. As sources tell NBC News, again, as I said earlier, that they are concerned that Saddam has hidden some of his mobile missiles and hidden them under highways and in deep ditches, and that these mobile missiles may be launched today. So no matter how successful the Pentagon and Secretary Cheney and others in Saudi Arabia say that this mission is, no matter how successful, that day two is on us, and he still has his mobile missiles. You know, nothing ever goes as planned in war. I think one of the adages is that no war plan survives contact with the enemy, and on day 2, although we've gotten a rosy assessment of day 1, day 2 is another story.
All right, Fred Francis at the Pentagon, thanks very much. We have Gary Sick here in New York, and we have in Amman, Jordan at this hour, NBC's Dennis Murphy. Amman is the capital that we have been watching with great care. It's the home to a lot of Palestinians. There were anti-American demonstrations in the street right up to the point of this war being launched. It's caught between Israel and Iraq itself, and a lot of those Palestinians have very fervent feelings about the United States in all of this, and they see Saddam Hussein as a champion. Dennis, anything going on in the streets of Amman?
Well, I was just looking from our perch here in the 15th floor over the city of Amman, Tom, and to me it looks like quite a normal day. A few cars lined up at the gas stations, but It seems to be a normal day, certainly a shocking one for them when they woke up this morning and found that the Iraqi military machine had apparently all but collapsed. Many supporters, as you say, for Saddam Hussein. I can tell you, Tom, that the international airport is closed. There are no planes coming in or out of Amman, Jordan. And the reason is that, encouraging as the news is about the increasing unlikelihood of a confrontation now between Iraq and Israel. That was the great fear here. Always have to talk about geography with Jordan in the middle. The fear less today that there will be that confrontation, but nonetheless the airspace is going to remain closed so they can keep a look on those skies. Tom, let's talk for a minute about the U.S. Dependents over here and those people carrying U.S. passports. Our best guess is that there are about 3,000 Americans who are still in the country. Now, 3 weeks ago, the U.S. Embassy here told those Americans that they suggested in a very strong fashion that they best get out of Amman, Jordan, as long as this crisis was occurring. Now, a few hours before the attack, I talked to some American women. Most of them are wives of Jordanian men. They have children who have American passports. And we talked about the crisis from an American point of view, living inside the culture, about their fears and how they were looking at the crisis. And here's some tape of some of their thoughts.
I don't believe the invasion of Kuwait was right. But I don't believe that our president in America has the right to let young boys be killed. For what?
And the American policy is disastrous as far as I'm concerned. They've never had a Middle Eastern policy. They want to appease Israel, and they want Arab oil. And they're trying to juggle always between these two opposing forces. You can't make friends of an enemy of the majority of people here and subsidize them and keep them in the Middle East in a very strong position.
That this war will be a war to outlast all other wars.
That was a sentiment that you heard a lot in the last few days, Tom, that this was going to be a huge war, it was going to be another Vietnam, and the United States did not know what it was getting into. Let me just say on the thought of the American dependents, if the streets here do become dangerous, and this is an if, we're looking forward possibly to civil unrest. There are a great many Saddam Hussein supporters in Amman, Jordan, as you pointed out. There's no saying what could happen. Could be nothing. But if there is trouble in the streets, the American embassy here does have some contingency plans to get the Americans out. And I should say there are no plans at this moment to evacuate those Americans. And I know there are a lot of people in the United States who may be watching concerned about friends and family here in Amman. And let me say, it seems to be a normal day. There's no reports of trouble in the street, and here we are going into to 9 o'clock. We should say, though, that coming up, in about an hour, Tom, we have the funeral of those 3 PLO leaders, 2 high-ranking aides to Yasser Arafat. That could be a very emotional event coming on this morning of all mornings.
All right, thank you very much. Dennis Murphy in Amman, Jordan tonight. It may be peaceful in Amman, but it is an attack is underway again, we're told, by CNN, which has the only line that it seems to be up and operating out of Baghdad. Bernie Shaw of CNN is reporting that that city is once again under attack, that the raids have been resumed. It is now daylight there. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. There's an hour difference between Jordan and Iraq. Fred Francis at the Pentagon, are you hearing anything about this?
No, Tom, but when we were on the air earlier, we saw or heard aircraft taking off from Dhahran, where Mike Betcher and Arthur Kent are, and that was approximately 20 minutes ago. And that's about the flying time between strike targets in southern Kuwait. So it doesn't surprise me at all. We were told earlier in the evening by sources here at the Pentagon that the sorties flown on day 2 during the day would be much heavier than the first 2 or 3 hours of combat over nighttime Iraq. And I would expect these attacks to continue all day long with the F-15 Strike Eagles and for the first time carrier-based jets, the A-6Es, the carrier bombers, the intruders, would be used. We were told they were not used in the initial attacks the first 2 or 3 hours at night, but they would be brought to bear here on the second day. What is the way the Pentagon has these ships positioned? There are 2 carriers in the northern Red Sea, 2 carriers in the northern Red Sea, and 2 carriers in the northern Persian Gulf, and in the lower Red Sea another carrier, and in the lower Persian Gulf another carrier. So the plan is for a sustained bombing campaign that goes from 3 to 10 days, and they're holding a carrier in reserve. And of course, on the land-based the land-based strike aircraft using approximately 150 Saudi Arabian planes, approximately 40 to 75 planes from the British, and more than 1,700. That's 1,700 American strike planes, which are based in Saudi Arabia and some of the surrounding countries, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And so those attacks will continue, and we expect them to be quite heavy and hit, again, some of the same targets. And Tom, we have now had time since daylight over there to get some battle damage assessment, and that won't be reported to us here at the Pentagon, but the satellites at first light will look down and immediately transmit the digital pictures of the targets right here, very close to the Pentagon, to a photo assessment, and those pictures will then be transmitted by satellite to the Central Command headquarters in Riyadh, and they will be able to pinpoint exactly what they did in the overnight bombing raids. And I believe, as Admiral Kendall Moranville told us earlier, many of those targets will have to be hit again. And the attacks at night are good attacks when they're surprising attacks, but they will have to be hit again. And the Pentagon has now confirmed, according to NBC correspondent Bob Hager, that the strikes are continuing, but that they're continuing heavy, but they never really stopped, according to the Pentagon. And so we're into day 2 here, and a lot of the same targets that were hit yesterday will be hit again. One of the targets I know that was hit, and our correspondent in Baghdad, Tom Aspel, described it. He said, "I see a large yellow light, large green flash." Well, I am told that was most probably one of Saddam Hussein's chemical plants, where he made precursor chemicals for poison gas. And that's the kind of flame that goes up when you hit a chemical plant, I'm told. It's that large green light. And so those are the kind of targets they'll go after again today. Tom?
All right, thank you very much, Fred Francis. Gary Sick, who is an authority on the Middle East and on what's going on in the Persian Gulf. What do we know about Saddam Hussein after this first attack? He comes out with all this rhetoric calling the United States the great Satan, saying that he's the protector of the holy sites and so on. What does it tell us about his mindset?
You know, I think there was one key word in that statement that he made in looking back about it, and he said that Iraq, in effect, will win when the will of the great Satan in the White House breaks. And I think it may be a real clue as to what was going on in his mind throughout this. We've all been trying to read his mind, mostly with no success, to try to figure out what was really going on in there. I think the initial statement that he made to April Glaspie, our former ambassador out in Baghdad, just before the attack began, believing that the United States could not take casualties, that the United States basically had no stomach for war, that we wouldn't go through with it. I think he must have believed that right up to the end. It's the only thing one can say that explains what appears to be a sort of abysmal lack of awareness of what was going on around him with 5 months warning.
I must say I was also struck when I talked to the people around him over the weekend that they saw this as a kind of a personal contest. They talked derisively about Bush, and not in a political way, but they said, you know, he went away and now he's so nervous and excited, and they kind of laughed as if they were tougher than he was, and they saw this as a barroom brawl of some kind.
Saddam has always, he has felt that the edge that he had over other leaders is that his nerves were more steely, that he could walk up to the brink and stay there longer than anybody else, that he could outbluff anybody in a game of chicken. And up to a point, you know, he has a point, because he has a country that will do whatever he wants them to do. There's never any argument that comes back at him. He can swerve and maneuver as quickly as he wants to, and he does have nerves of steel. But it seems to me he really began believing his own propaganda as he got close to the end, and in fact was not ready to believe that it would come. And I think he was also judging by 8 years of war with Iran. And he believed, he kept saying over and over, we've been through war. We know what war is. We know what it's all about. And you can't teach us anything about that, and we are experienced. But he had never experienced anything like this, even for a day, throughout that entire period of time. There was nothing.
One was aimed at you, and you knew the other was aimed at them, and yet it was all the same type of light rippling through the sky.
Go eat breakfast, look at the next mission, and get ready for the next goal.
It's about time. We're glad.
it was a good feeling to know that we made the first move and sort of got things accomplished.
This is a very serious business, that we are in the very early stages of an operation that may run for a considerable period of time. That there have been casualties, and there are likely to be more casualties. So while we feel very good about the progress to date, it is important, I think, for everyone to be careful about claiming victory.
I took a 4-ship F-15 up on the first wave that went up to Baghdad area last night. Getting out of that.
To date, the operation is going very well. At present, we are in the process of using our intelligence assets to assess the damage that has been achieved. As that process is completed, decisions will be made about going back to restrike those targets that require additional attention.
From NBC News, America at War continues. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good afternoon, everyone. Operation Desert Storm continues unabated as the United States and its allies continue to rain destruction down on military targets in Kuwait and in Iraq itself. We're told that there is a new wave of attacks underway right now. As of about 9:30 Eastern Standard Time this morning, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, said that more than 1,000 sorties or missions had been flown against military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. So far, at that hour at least, only one American loss, a pilot in an F-18 killed, 2 British pilots killed as well. It is remarkably successful so far, although military experts, led by Dick Cheney, are cautioning everyone not to get ahead of this story, that there is still much to be done. The bombing may go on for days, perhaps as long as 1 week. Around the world, there is general euphoria in the world financial markets. The stock market in the United States is way up. Oil prices are way down. There are new security considerations, however, at government installations in Europe and in other places. Saddam Hussein, what can be on his mind? We cannot know at this hour. We do know, however, that all communications has been cut off. Iraqi television this morning showed Saddam Hussein speaking hours after the first air raids. He told his people that the infidels, as he called them, had attacked the believers. And he said, "The will of the devil in the White House will be destroyed." He also said, with the help of God, we will unite the peninsula. That, of course, is a reference to the Arabian Peninsula that includes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The broadcast ran for approximately 5 minutes. It was received here within the past hour. So far, however, Saddam Hussein is much better with words than he is with air defenses. There has been no counterstrike whatsoever. What we've gotten from him mostly are threats and no indication whatsoever that his military is prepared to stand up to this kind of an air onslaught. If he does have a second wave strategy in mind, it is hard to know what it is at this hour. NBC's John Cochran is at the White House. President Bush serving as commander-in-chief throughout all of this. John?
Tom, the president is back in the White House after having gone across the river, across the Potomac, to Fort Myer, the military base there that has been so important in other past wars, including World War II. He went over there for a prayer service conducted by the Reverend Billy Graham, who was his house guest here at the White House last night. Reverend Graham said during that service that there are times when you must fight for peace, and I pray, he said, that we will be on God's side. Some of the president's cabinet members attended that service with him. They will be meeting here with the president at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Washington time. There's a lot for the cabinet to do. When you go to war, there's a lot that other agencies have to do, like the Energy Department, certainly the State Department, Jim Baker, and there are a lot of facilities which have to be geared up for a war, and the president will be talking about that. The president also met this morning with congressional leaders. He told them it was important for them to be seen with him. It was important for him to be seen communicating to them. He also told them that the air raids were technically perfect, but he said he didn't want to be too optimistic. He didn't want to mislead the American people. Let's take a look at some of what the president had to say.
I think all of us are very pleased that so far the operation is going forward with great success, and we keep praying that the loss of life will be held at an absolute minimum. And I feel so strongly about our troops over there. Certainly I feel that way about them, and I feel that way about the innocents who might get caught up in this conflict.
So the president talking there about innocents, presumably he's speaking about civilians, Iraqi, Kuwaiti civilians, Westerners, of course, who are caught over in Baghdad. Now, after the meeting with the congressional leaders, some of them came outside in the White House driveway, spoke to us. I was struck by the fact that some of the Democrats, George Mitchell, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, and Tom Foley, the House Speaker, were not jumping on a George Bush bandwagon. They gave him their support. They were subdued in their remarks. They also spoke about their concern for innocent civilians. So even though there was a show of bipartisanship here, the people who voted against this resolution up on the Hill, these leaders who were opposed to giving the president this vote of support last Saturday and who lost that, and of course the president won, they were not showing still any great enthusiasm for this war, Tom.
All right, John Cochran, what's the president's schedule for the rest of the day? What can we expect to see from him?
Well, of course, he's going to be in constant briefings with his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and Scowcroft's deputy, Bob Gates, who is an important player around here. We don't see him very often. You usually see Brent Scowcroft. Bob Gates is almost as important. He, of course, has a lot of CIA experience. He was the deputy director over at the CIA. A lot of people still think he will be head of the CIA one day, as George Bush was. As I said, the president will be meeting with his cabinet at 3 p.m., and there's a lot that the president will want to tell them about gearing up for this war. He'll want to tell them how long he thinks this may go on, and to tell them to get their people ready for a lot of long hours and work on weekends, Tom.
All right, John Cochran, thank you very much. The bulk of this attack so far has been carried out by American F-15 pilots, of course. There is a contingent from the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing at Langley, Virginia. They're stationed at Dhahran. We have now an interview with one of them. This is Captain Steve Tate.
F-15 fighters are still flying into combat at regular intervals from this base in Saudi Arabia's eastern province. Returning pilots say they've met surprisingly little resistance in the skies over Iraq, but caution that it's too early to say the skies have been won.
There's no doubt in my mind what the final result of this is going to be. It's just going to be how long it takes Saddam Hussein to figure it out.
Air Force Captain Steve Tate escorted a bombing mission into Iraq. Suddenly, an Iraqi fighter appeared on the tail of his wingman. Tate maneuvered his F-15 fighter into position, executed 2 hard turns, established radar lock, and fired his missile.
I just let one Fox 1 go, and about 4 miles in front of me get a huge fireball. Actually, I get the missile coming off, which is a big flash coming off. Get a huge fireball, and the airplane blows up.
Like other returning pilots, Tate's been providing the only eyewitness accounts of bombing raids outside of Baghdad. Senior Air Force commanders at this base cannot confirm or deny Iraqi reports that there have been Allied aircraft downed, but pilots returning from the second wave of airstrikes on Iraq insist there have been no casualties from these squadrons. Jeffrey Matsumoto with the Air Force 1st Tactical Fighter Wing, Eastern Saudi Arabia.
That 1st Tactical Fighter Wing, of course, was one of the first units to arrive in Saudi Arabia. They were there shortly after the invasion of Kuwait, and they felt as if they were kind of perched on the edge of a precipice at that time because there were no ground support forces for them. NBC's Fred Francis is at the Pentagon. Fred, what's the latest? Is there a new wave of attacks underway?
Yes, Tom, there are. I was told by senior Pentagon officials that what we're going to see over the next 24 to 48 hours are constant attacks, not just from the F-15 Strike Eagles, but from virtually everything in the arsenal, including the B-52s. They caution us here that the U.S. does not now have air superiority. They are waiting for all of the Iraqi fighters, the F-1 Mirage French version of the Iraqi fighter to come up. They're waiting for the MiG-29s. As we just heard from that F-15 pilot, some of them have come up. They're waiting for the rest of them to come up. And they think that by the night's end and certainly into tomorrow, they'll have air superiority. We heard earlier that here at the Pentagon that this was going to be slow, methodical, a piece at a time. A senior Pentagon official just said, this is not going to be fast and furious. We're going to take it very carefully. He says we're going to just like slice off a piece of bologna at a time. He said expect this thing to go up to 10 days. And the ultimate goal is to be so methodical about it that U.S. ground forces will never have to go into a major land battle. And that's the ultimate goal of this campaign. The officials tell me, Tom, that the great success of this so far has been the electronic countermeasures. That these aircraft, large 707s and C-130s jammed with electronic equipment, have been able to totally blind the Iraqi radar and cause all of the Iraqi communications just to go dead. And the aircraft have been able to go in and hit their targets unseen, totally and completely unseen by air defense radars and totally unseen by the ground control radars. And finally, Colin Powell said earlier this morning, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, let's not be euphoric about it. And one of the reasons he is cautioning is there is an Iraqi counterpunch. The U.S. knows about it. And if we can listen to Colin Powell talking about the threat of the mobile missiles, that's the concern here in the Pentagon.
That was not to suggest we aren't equally concerned about mobile launchers, but they're much more difficult to target and find. So they are a high priority target if we can locate them on the battlefield, so to speak. But because they are mobile, you can't predict where they're liable to be. But all of our systems are tuned up and queued trying to locate mobile Scud launchers, of course.
Now, Tom, there are 75 mobile missiles, those Scud missiles, ground-to-ground missiles. They have a range anywhere from 270 miles to 375 miles. The United States knows that the Iraqis have 75 of them, and what the Iraqis have done is they've buried some of these missiles. They've buried them in sand revetments, they've buried them under highways, and right now you have U.S. F-15s and F-16s flying cap patrols over Kuwait, waiting for those missiles to come out of their hiding places, to turn their radars on, to turn their electronic signatures on, so that they can be attacked. So that's the Iraqi counterpunch, and what we know about Saddam Hussein, what we know about 8 years of war with Iraq, he may very well wait many days before he tries to launch those missiles. So we're not out of this by a long shot.
Thanks very much, Fred Francis at the Pentagon this morning. We want to tell you as well that in Iraq, all communications by foreign journalists have been cut off now by the Iraqi government. CNN had a special arrangement in which they were able to get a clear line out of there. We were able to get intermittent telephone calls, but as of about an hour ago now, that has all been cut off, and the journalists, we were told, are being taken to what the Iraqis describe as a safe location. We await further word from them. America's principal Western ally in all of this, of course, has been Great Britain. British pilots were in the air last night as well with their Tornado jets. In fact, 2 of them were lost in the initial bombing raids. Here's some of the debate that we heard today in the House of Commons in London.
Isn't peace important? And isn't it the case that he is really a puppet of the President of the United States?
It is justice. It is justice that is important in the Gulf region. The honourable gentleman may have his own views about the nature of the regime there. I have mine. I think Saddam Hussein and his regime is thoroughly evil, and I believe it is entirely right for the United Nations to give the authority that it has done. And I am delighted that it has the overwhelming support of this country, even though I regret it does not have the honourable gentleman's support as well.
Was this war really necessary in terms of the United Nations' own resolution 678, as sanctions had not been given a full chance to operate?
Yes, it was necessary. Absolutely, totally and completely necessary. And the honourable gentleman, if he does not think so, is in a minority.
That's British Prime Minister John Majors, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, defending his government's point of view. in the House of Commons this morning. That's British democracy in action there in the well of the House of Commons. Labour members of Parliament challenging him whether this was necessary or not. Major's case made more effective today by what has been the success so far, that I think that it's fair to say. The international and American financial markets are swinging wildly at this hour, all on the upside. We'll get to that in just a few moments, but let's go to Arthur Kent now in Saudi Arabia. Arthur, what's the latest there? Any more takeoffs from the base at Dhahran?
Yes, Tom, a pretty steady scrambling of American and Saudi F-15 interceptor aircraft. These are planes that we assume will be going up and flying shotgun over the bombing raids that are taking place over Kuwait and Iraq. Just to update you, since the last time we spoke last night, there has been only one reported incident of a sustained Iraqi strike at Saudi territory, and that was a rather ragged Iraqi artillery barrage from southern Kuwait into the Saudi northern coastal town of Khafji, but no great damage reported there. One of our colleagues from BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, who are posted with a British MOD, Ministry of Defense pool a little bit further north of here, said that there were some U.S. Marine aircraft, helicopters, and Harrier jump jets that had gone in response to that artillery barrage, but we have no independent confirmation of that. Otherwise, no further word on those 4 or 5 Scud missile impacts that were reported last night. However, one bright piece of news confirmed by the Egyptian 4th Armored Brigade was that some 50 Iraqi tanks surrendered in the early stages of this attack last night. We would assume those would be frontline troops, not really Saddam Hussein's prime, hardest fighters in Kuwait.
Arthur Kent, do you have any word there on how quickly these F-15 crews will have to rotate back into the skies again? They'll go out, fly a mission, and be on the ground for how long before they go back up again?
No longer than 30 minutes, Tom, and certainly what we're seeing here is a steady cycling of aircraft. We can only assume, because we are not getting a confirmation or release of information here or in the Saudi capital of Riyadh. We're depending on information released from the Pentagon, but we can only assume that this level of activity by interceptor aircraft means that, as General Colin Powell indicated earlier today, it cannot be assumed that the Iraqi Air Force and air defense system has been totally knocked out, that whenever U.S. and coalition aircraft are proceeding on these raids over Iraq and Kuwait, that they're going to need a lot of protection, just in case Iraqi MiGs or Mirage aircraft take off to intercept them.
Thank you very much, Arthur Kent. We'll be back and take a look at the pocketbook issues of all of this in a moment.
Mama keeps yellow dandy like a dandelion. Oh, you know I love my mama. Mama keeps white, bright like the sunshine. I just want to thank my mama.
Clorox 2 Color Safe Bleach keeps clothes looking newer, longer. Detergents alone can leave colors dull and lifeless. Clorox 2 removes stains, makes colors pop.
Oh, you know I love my mama. Mama's got the magic of Clorox 2.
If this is a cold, this is the flu. Cold. If what you've got is more than a simple cold, now there's Metaflu, with the maximum dosage of 4 strong medicines to give you flu-strength relief for even your worst symptoms. New Metaflu from Parke-Davis. For more than a cold. For the flu. Metaflu.
I'm a second-half quarterback.
Now that was a stellar performance.
Super Buckets.
Have some chicken. You look weak. His arm is weak.
Called aging. From Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Trivia, guys. Who has the record for most fumbles?
You mean before today?
15 pieces of chicken or a supersized bucket of hot wings, just $9.99 each.
Wait till the second half.
All right, rally.
Anytime you're ready, gentlemen.
Super Buckets from KFC.
Come on, Dad.
Doctors measure back pain by how far you can bend. Extra Strength Dones is made for back pain relief with an ingredient these pain relievers don't have. Dones makes back pain go away. Extra Strength Dones, the back specialist.
This toothpaste will blow you away. Wow. With a breath freshener that's a brush of fresh air. Wow. It's Aquafresh Extra Fresh with a breath freshener that beats the leading brand. Aquafresh Extra Fresh. It's a brush of fresh air.
In the fog of combat, there are occasionally some confusing news reports. We just had one from Arthur Kent in Saudi Arabia that the crews of 50 Iraqi tanks deserted and surrendered to Egyptian forces. But at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and through other reliable military sources, we're told that that probably is an erroneous report. There is no evidence of that kind of very substantial surrender on the part of Iraqi armor so far. That kind of thing is expected during the course of the confusion in the first hours of combat. Here are some numbers for you. The Dow Jones up 87 points, up almost 96 points at one point, based on the early optimistic reports of Operation Desert Storm. And oil down $9 a barrel to about $23 a barrel. You'll recall that it was running around $18 a barrel before the invasion of Kuwait. NBC's chief financial correspondent is Mike Jensen, and he's at the stock market right now. Mike, what's the reason for all of this?
Tom, first let me kind of describe the scene to you this morning. At 9:30 when the exchange opened, they had a moment of silence for our boys overseas. Then a great cheer went up, and then, as you said, the stock market took off like a rocket. It went up almost 100 points in the first hour, and since then it has steadied down a bit and lost about 10 points. It was following the lead of the markets overseas. Virtually the same thing had happened in Tokyo and London and Europe. And gold prices, which had been rising in anticipation of a crisis, came tumbling down. Oil prices took perhaps the biggest hit of all, down first $7.50 on the mercantile exchange, then they hit a pause in trading, which was mandated by the exchange, and then down another $1.50. So the big question is, what's going on here? It is a kind of euphoria. The markets all over the world had been dreading what was going to happen in the Persian Gulf. So when there was a successful action yesterday, it triggered a kind of collective sigh of relief all over the country. What the traders and the brokers are telling me today is, this is all very good. We love it here. We love what's happening, but we don't think it's over in the Persian Gulf, and don't expect tomorrow to be the same kind of day on the markets that today was.
All right, Mike Jensen, you'll stand by there, and I have with me in the studio here in New York, Robert Hormats of Goldman Sachs on Wall Street, former Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. Mr. Hormats, I think that prudence is the best word probably right now in terms of what's going to happen ultimately to the financial markets.
I think that's right. The markets now have heaved a collective sigh of relief that the war has not gone badly. In fact, it's going very well. But I do think that now one has to be a bit cautious because wars can turn and you can't tell.
But let's project the optimistic scenario if we can. Say oil does come back to around $20 a barrel. What does that mean for the American recession, which is now underway?
Well, it's a very positive boost for the economy. Lower oil prices mean that you have more money to spend on other things because you spend less on oil. That means it gives a boost to other types of industries. Lower oil prices also mean, of course, lower inflation rates, and that's a big positive benefit for the American economy. It also means interest rates tend to go down when inflation expectations go down, and that means it's easier to finance your house or your car.
In a way, the war on the home front is the economic war that President Bush will have to address once this one is over. What would be your advice to him about what he ought to do next now that he has the nation's attention on these issues?
Well, I do think we need an energy policy. We cannot make ourselves vulnerable again, as we have been, to oil price increases in the Middle East. Second, we probably need to deal with the educational problem. That really is, I think, at the heart of our overall economic problem. The Fed probably needs also to continue to ease monetary policy. That would be helpful as well.
Can you talk about the psychology of the country after a military victory, if this turns out to be one?
The country will be in a very euphoric mood, and the president will be riding high. His popularity will be enormous. It's a great time to go back and develop a comprehensive economic policy to deal with the underlying difficulties in our economy. This will help, but we need to deal with the fundamentals in order to really improve the economy.
Robert Hormats, thanks very much. Man well known on Wall Street and in the corridors of power in Washington as well. We'll be back with continuing coverage after this. It does appear that an attack of some kind is underway tonight.
Last night, America went to war. Tonight, that story in a special one-hour edition of NBC Nightly News.